Hello, everybody, and welcome back to day 2 of our Unraveling Threads conference, exploring fashion, violence, and trauma. So thank you so much for joining us and for being here. I see we have Claire from Philadelphia in the US, so thank you. It's not easy with the time difference, so that's much appreciated. And Isha from London as well. I'm also in London. So thank you so much for coming today. We had a fantastic first day of the conference yesterday. We had a really rich range of papers, discussions, some wonderful speakers, and some really interesting and important themes that were coming up as part of this conference. And I'm really excited to continue today. We also have another fantastic lineup and a wonderful selection of speakers and papers. We've got an interview, industry presentation. We're starting with a screening now. So it's going to be a really nice, exciting and varied day. So thank you again. We have Olga from Moscow as well. Fantastic. So I'm really pleased to say that we do have a packed schedule, so we'll try and keep to time as much as possible. We're going to start now with Rebecca's wonderful screening and discussion, and we'll have a couple more sessions this morning, followed by a lunch break at 1:30, and today we'll be ending at 5:30. So it's my absolute pleasure now to welcome Dr. Rebecca Arnold. And Rebecca is a senior lecturer in history of dress at the Courtauld Institute of Art. She's lectured internationally and published extensively on 20th and 21st century fashion. She's currently working on a new book documenting fashion, dress, and visual culture in the 1920s and 1930s. And that'll be published by Bloomsbury in 2023. So really looking forward to that, Rebecca. And today, Rebecca is going to be presenting to you Black and Tan Fantasy from 1929. She's also going to introduce it and talk to you about it. So it'll be a screening and discussion for our first session this morning. Although less than 20 minutes in length, Black and Tan Fantasy portrays a powerful message of Black virtuosity encapsulated in Duke Ellington's musical performance, which provides the emotional register, shifting from uplift to expressions of trauma and unity in the final scene. Starring Ellington and Freddie Washington, Black and Tan Fantasy allows us to experience the ways costume, body, movement, and gesture combined within 1920s jazz and the role these elements played within Black art and performance. The deep emotions that the film conveys are heightened by the visual techniques deployed by director W. Murphy, who had previously directed Ballet Mécanique from 1924 with Fernand Léger. The film's impact depends upon Ellington and Washington's elegant, intelligent, expressed through dance and music as conduits of pain, trauma, and importantly, the potential for healing. So thank you so much, Rebecca, and I'll hand over you now to talk about the film.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm just sharing my screen now so that I can show you my slides, and I'll then move on to show you the film. I wanted to introduce you first of all to some of the context and conditions relating to the production of Black and Tan Fantasy in 1929. This was the first appearance of Duke Ellington on screen. He was already a star, a jazz star, principally through his music, of course, but also through his popularity on radio. And his manager, Irving Wells, wanted to widen his appeal, disseminate his image further, and also to connect to a wider interracial audience. So it's important that this was produced under the auspices of RKO Studios, a mainstream white Hollywood movie studio, and it meant that it would be shown as part of a program. So there'd be the feature, newsreels, perhaps a jazz short, etc., that would be shown. It's based, or it uses throughout the film Black and Tan Fantasy, which was a 1927 song which Ellington had composed with his trumpeter Bubba Miley. There were quite a number of these jazz shorts. This is an early one, and it's really important to remember that it's also a really early talkie. So it's a very early opportunity for music and image to be combined in this way. There are a whole range of them. There are others featuring Duke Ellington from into the 30s. There's also Cab Calloway, there's Bessie Smith, who I'm going to show you a clip from in a moment. And they're really fascinating because they usually use a fictionalized version of the jazz musician themselves. So they blur the line between on and off screen personae. And they're very, very important as examples of showing Black excellence, of showing Black virtuosity through song, through music, composition, through dance and movement. And what we see in this one is an example of Black performers portrayed as intelligent professionals, rather than, as was usual in mainstream white Hollywood, which was where Black actors were usually cast as maids and servants and were not given starring roles or driving the plot or the narrative. And when performers such as the Nicholas Brothers, the amazing dancers, would perform within a film, that their section would be cut when it was shown in the southern states of America. So it's a very important and interesting film for a number of reasons. It's also really interesting because it exposes the tensions within Black life and renders more complex what I think from 100 years distance is often a quite polarized idea of the Harlem Renaissance and of Harlem in this period. This is an amazing map by E. Sims Campbell from 1932. I'm going to talk about the Cotton Club in a moment, and you can see that's down in the bottom corner there. What we see in Black and Tan fantasy is at the beginning, Ellington and his trumpeter, in this case Arthur Wetzel, in a very kind of sparse, poor environment, and they're about to have their piano repossessed. And we move from that relative poverty to the luxury and extravagance of the Cotton Club itself. And Ellington was already a fixture at the club. He'd been appearing there with his orchestra since 1927, and he has long residences there, on and off into the early 1930s. Harlem, as you see from this 1932 map, was both a reality and a myth, even during the 1920s. And Survey Graphic, the journal Survey Graphic, had a whole issue devoted to it in 1925, and this is how it describes Harlem. Harlem is merely a rough rectangle of commonplace city blocks lying between and to east and west of Lenox and 7th Avenues, stretching nearly a mile north and south. Another Harlem is savored by the few, a Harlem of racy music and racier dancing, of cabarets famous or notorious according to their kind, of amusement in which abandon and sophistication sit cheek by jowl. Beneath this lies again the Harlem of the newspapers, a Harlem of monster parades and political flummery. So you get this sense of Harlem taking on different characters at different parts of the day, but even within this relatively small area of Upper Manhattan, being very diverse. And the film that we're going to watch in full celebrates and displays Black art and creativity, and the performers need to express themselves. But this uplifting emotion is underscored by inherited trauma and pain. And this is embodied in the figure of Freddie Washington's tragic dancer, who I'll describe in a second. Now, as you can see from these slides of Duke Ellington and Duke Ellington with his orchestra, Ellington was always really impeccably dressed. I'm not talking about dress that much in this introduction because I want us to talk about that once you've seen the film and to discuss it together. But Ellington would go on to be a screen star as well, appearing in a number of full-length films, the first one being Check and Double Check. And he was really, probably the most important band leader of the interwar period and beyond. And what's really unique in his work is he was really able to capture and encourage the kind of specialness of each individual musician and musical instrument, but also to consider the different parts of the orchestra within his compositions. As you will see in the film, he was also really interesting in his use of different genres of music. So in the film, you'll see him take gospel music, mix it into jazz, and even Chopin's Funeral March becomes part of Black and Tan fantasy. And I think there's a very self-conscious self-fashioning in the way he presents himself, the way his orchestra presents itself, um, as a kind of cultivated masculinity, a very sophisticated, modern idea of masculinity. And you can contrast the way you see him, even in the domestic interior, the poor domestic interior at the beginning. You can contrast him and Arthur Wetzel to the two comedians who turn up to repossess his piano. And can I just, as a side note, I know we have lots of very brilliant people with us this morning. I really want to know what the kind of hat is that one of the movers is wearing. It's a bit like a Vivienne Westwood buffalo hat with two dents. So just as a side note, please let me know if you know what that's called. The other star of the film is Freddie Washington, a really, really interesting actor. This is Carl van Vechten. He photographed her a number of times. This is his photograph of her. She was already known as an actor and dancer. She'd worked very early in her career with Josephine Baker, who would continue to mentor her. She was known as an actor and dancer within the theatre. This is a very early on-screen, if not the first on-screen appearance by her. And she's a really fascinating person. She also worked as a writer. She did dabble in Hollywood, but was continually throughout her career subject to colorism, because as a Black woman who was light-skinned and pale-eyed, and is best known, in fact, for playing Paola in Imitation of Life in the 1934 version of Fannie Hurst's novel. So she played a woman who passes, and this was something that kind of haunted her throughout her life. Now, I want to show you a couple of clips now before we move on to the main feature, as it were. Dudley Murphy directed Black and Tan Fantasy, and he had previously been in Paris working with a lot of very well-known now modern artists. And this clip I'm going to show you is from 1924 film Ballet Mécanique, which he directed with Fernand Léger. And so what you will see in this clip, I should say it's silent, so don't worry if you don't hear anything, is he uses a beveled prism on the lens of the camera to get these kaleidoscopic effects. So please take note of that, because you will see that also in Black and Tan Fantasy. Also, I think you can see his interest in jazz music and the influence of jazz music on his work and on all of these modern artists' work, particularly in the kind of cutting, fragmented jolts between different rhythms, but they are doing it through image. And what you will see in Black and Tan Fantasy is this done through music. So I'm going to play this. As I said, there's no sound. And what you get instead is this very sort of sensual montage of imagery, shapes, bodies, objects, which are collaged together into a dance of loosely connected yet dislocated images. Dudley Murphy had also had returned to America and worked on St. Louis Blues, which was again also in 1929, but came out slightly before Black and Tan Fantasy. And this foregrounds the jazz singer Bessie Smith, and is a really sad tale of her having a terrible boyfriend who treats her appallingly, and her retreating to a club to sing. And so the music swells, and it's much less visually experimental than Black and Tan Fantasy, but I want to just show you a really moving literally and metaphorically, tracking shot, which takes us from Bessie Smith across the club. So we see her band, we see the Hall Johnson Choir, who are singing the backing to her lament, and who form a really beautiful kind of sonic, haptic, visual swell of emotion through the screen. And I think also create a really interesting rhythm and narrative through the kind of details of their dress. So this one does have music. And what we see in Black and Tan Fantasy is the combination of these European modern art influences returning to America and being used to create this incredibly visually rich evocation of emotion, of trauma, of pain, being released through music, through dance, through creativity. But also, I think really importantly, is thinking about the ways in which really quite subtle details within the dress add to and shape our experience of this. I think Pamela Cockey's phrase, the Afro-Americanization of popular culture, is really important in this case, of this kind of transnational hybridity of African-American jazz being taken to Europe, of European white artists being hugely influenced by both Africa and African-American cultures, and then these influences being taken back to America and being used in the creation of, in this case, a jazz short. And you see this in the nightclub scene, also in the final scene when Freddie Washington's character is on her deathbed. And think about the way in which shadow and light and movement create and add to our experience of the emotion and the release of this section of the film. But also, as you can see in this still, the way, you know, the sleeves, the necklace add to our connection to the people shown in the film. And this is ultimately played out in the final scene where Freddie Washington dies, and we are once again, we are not just seeing the emotion, we are hearing it, but we are also inside it because of the way in which Dudley Murphy directed and the cinematography, that it's from Freddie Washington's perspective. So what we see in this film is a combination of reality and fantasy, poverty and luxury, day and night in Harlem, and the contrast between everyday and performance dress. Murphy's editing and use of camera techniques create a further layer connecting viewer to performer and performance and heightening the music's emotional impact. So it deploys cinematic techniques which are very avant-garde to enhance the music's impact and to strengthen both the viewers and Freddie Washington in particular character's point of view, which is incredibly powerful, especially during this period when cinemas were still segregated. So let's not waste any more time. Let's now watch the film itself. So this is Black and Tan Fantasy of 1929.
Well, this here is the place, but I wonder which one of these here numbers is it here? Is it on the paper there? Sure. Well, read it then. This here number's gonna give me a whole lot of trouble. Well, we better hurry and get that piano out of here. But the boss said for us to be back at the store at 4 o'clock. What time is it now, Action? Let's see. There it is. Sure is. Yeah. I told you the number there. Oh, you ain't told me that. Ain't no steps made like that, man. I know this was the place all the time. Hush. Hey, what are you fellas doing coming here like this? Brother, remove your anatomy from that mahogany. We come here to move it today. Well, you're not going to take my piano, are you? I ain't going to take your icebox. Why, you ain't paid nothing on it since last October. Esther? Yeah? Do your duty. What you going to do? We come here to move the piano, didn't we? We did. Well, I got 2 pieces and you ain't got but 1. Dude, I got some wonderful news. I just landed a job in a nightclub. I'm going to dance, and you're going to play. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. Hey, what are you boys doing here? We moving the piano. Oh, you can't take off piano. We done taken it. Come on, Sarsaparilla. Hey, wait a minute. Here's $10. $5 a piece. Okay. No, ma'am, lady. We don't do business that way. Come on, Eczema. Oh, wait a minute. Come on, Zema. Oh, well, now listen, lady. If you want your piano to stay here for a few more days, I guess we can let it stay. $1? Yes, ma'am. Esper? Yeah. Put that piano stool back where it belongs at. Take that dust and put it over there. You want to let taste of this, Jane? I do it. All right, ain't it? All right. Yeah. There. Pick up that rope there. Come on out here and remember when we get to the store, these folks wasn't home. I remember. All right. Oh, say, what are you going to do with that? What? I clever got I had your gin in my hand. Oh, that's all right. Keep it. Give me my glass. Thank you, miss. Thank you. Listen, don't forget, there was no one at home. Yes, ma'am. Gee, I'm glad that's over. But you know, honey, we can't take that job. Why can't we? Well, you know what the doctor said about your heart. You can't dance. Oh, don't bother about my heart. What's that? Something you're writing? That's a new number I'm writing. Oh, play it for me? Sure. All right. Come on, let's run this over for Freddie. Well, she's better now, and I'm going to have her come out here and do a little dance for you. The inimitable Freddie Washington. Let's go, Duke. Hey, boy, get him out of here, quick. Sit down, Duke, and play something. Play the girl's number. Get the show on. Keep the show on. Don't tell him now. Wait till after the show. Close that curtain.
Sing me the Black and Tan Sabbath.
Hello. Well, I hope you found that interesting. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I mean, what a treat to start the day with. That was just spectacular. Such a huge range of references and influences and styles and masterful cinematography. It was just beautiful. So thank you for screening that for us. We've already got some lovely comments in the chat. So please do keep your comments, thoughts, questions coming in. So if Beatrice has said that there's an interesting contrast between Duke Ellington being casual at home and the man playing the trumpet not even taking his hat off.
Yes, no, it's really fascinating. I think the kind of levels of casualness and formality and the kind of calibrations that are very subtle, yes, between sort of Arthur Wetzel, who remains as though he's in his outdoor clothes, essentially, and then Duke Ellington, who I think is expressing the fact that his ownership of that space, which is then owned a second time, I think, through the music. So I think there's really, really subtle details, like the watch chains, for example, Duke Ellington's versus the Movers watch chain. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you, Beatrice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the idea of contrast and juxtaposition is so sort of crucial throughout the whole film, really. So both as Beatrice mentioned and in so many other aspects as well, especially in the dress. I think you mentioned in your introduction the contrast between sort of everyday dress and then the idea of performance dress, and that sort of comes throughout the film as well.
Exactly, and I think it's also worth noting that at this stage in film production, it's quite possible they're wearing their own clothes as well, which adds another layer. You know, that obviously they're conscious they're on screen, so there may have been someone shaping what they wore, but it may have been just that they were told to bring that kind of an outfit to wear. So they're very strange, I think, these films, in the way they blur these jazz musicians' actual, like their actual persona, their jazz persona, and then the persona which is adopted on the screen.
Absolutely. So really mixing those different identities to bring this one film.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just speaking of dress, we've got some other lovely comments to go through, but can you talk a little bit more about Freddie's amazing costume, the glittering performance?
Yes. I mean, obviously the club, that the set that is representing the club is meant to be the Cotton Club, and they reference that, which was white owned, almost entirely a white audience, and the costumes that the performers wore, the Black performers, were often very spectacular. What I think is what I really noticed with this one is on the one hand, it's really spectacular that it's just a kind of lattice work of strips with rhinestones on, so that when she moves, it's almost like she becomes an electrical current with the light sparking, because you only really see the sparkle. And the way in which her movement and the costume combines with that, it reminds me of what Andrea Stewart wrote about in Showgirls, of the idea of a showgirl's costume framing nakedness. But what I think is interesting as well with this is it looks too big for her. You know, somehow something that scanty also doesn't look like it fits. And so the lattice across her stomach seems too loose, and it kind of emphasizes this idea that she's frail and vulnerable. And also the dips on either side of her hips, I think, add to that sense of it being, it gives a sort of sense that it could fall apart at any moment, which I know a costume like that may look like that anyway, but I think there's something about how thin she seems in comparison to that framework. I think it emphasizes her vulnerability.
Thank you. I have another comment from Claire, who says, the men wear bright white collars, which highlight the color of their skin, whereas Freddie Washington wore a beige draped blouse with less contrast. And in her dancing costume, it's so brightly lit that her skin color is barely apparent. It's a really nice one to follow on from what you were just explaining.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Claire. It's really, really interesting. And I think I think it just really makes you notice every single detail, because as you say, there's like the Duke Ellington his shirt is so bright white, and yes, so it does contrast with his skin, but then it's the movers' shirts are white, but not as white as that. So it's emphasizing their status in a different way. And I think, yes, and then that sort of softly draped silk on Freddie Washington is definitely kind of de-emphasizing the shade of her skin almost, or kind of connecting with the shade of her skin. But again, it's like a softness and a vulnerability to her.
Thank you. And Sophie says, superb, innovative filming techniques with the silhouettes, reflections on the mirrors, the panning of scenes, and cut glass lens.
Yes, thank you. So amazing. And I've watched so many of these jazz shorts, and this one really stands out, I think, as the most exciting in terms of camera technique. And so fascinating to think that he also did ballet mécanique, and you can really see the connections. But also, yes, just from the sets of having that mirror, and we have to, I should have mentioned the 5 hot shots who do that amazing in sync dance that's then in the reflection as well. And I think that's a really interesting thing that actually links to what you talked about yesterday, Lucy, of images that are kind of doubling and destabilizing. And that's done through the mirrors, through the lighting, through the shadows in the final scene. So I think the sets are really important as well, particularly the middle one.
Thank you. And on that note, would you like to talk a little bit more about the choreography? I thought there were some incredibly beautiful moments and just real interesting uses of the human body. I mean, that moment you mentioned where that they come together and they're sort of moving as one. It's about 5 bodies or so,
yes,
functioning almost as one body altogether. And I thought that's quite interesting implications on the body and its status. It almost looks quite mechanical.
No, I think there's definitely an element of mechanization in that, and of the precision that's needed to do that. So there's kind of a virtuosity of dancing and movement, but also of that becoming then machine-like in a strange way. I think as well, like you say, that there's that they're 5 as one, and that the excitement and interest of watching is how well they can seem like they're one body when they're 5 bodies. And I also really like, I don't know if you noticed, but their trousers are slightly flared so that you notice their feet more. So you get the kind of gloss on their shoes, the stripe of the satin on their trousers. So you don't particularly look at the head. You're continually confused. And also the fact that you see it twice, so temporality becomes confused as well, that we seem to watch that act once from our perspective, and then again from Freddie Washington's perspective through the beveled prism that makes it kaleidoscopic. So it's as though each effect is then doubled and doubled and doubled.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so fascinating. I think what you're describing, it really speaks against this idea of the contrast that does come throughout the film. This idea you mentioned with Freddie's costume, it makes her seem electric. Then we have the dancers becoming a mechanical sort of unified body, but yet that really contrasts the strong emotion that's so apparent throughout the film. It's kind of the vulnerability and the kind of fragility of human experience at the same time.
Yes.
So you've got this contrast there.
Yes, I think Duke Ellington, if you listen to his music, is so accomplished at evoking and wrapping you in a mood, and then taking you through different stages within that mood and that emotion. And I think in that scene, you're really, the visuals are really in sync with what's happening in the music. And I saw someone just flash up about the mirrored floor, that at one point you're suddenly underneath Freddie Washington. So you're kind of never quite allowed to stay long enough on one kind of, because even when you see Freddie Washington with that swirly, not carpet, what do I mean? Curtain, it's already disorientating before we've even got the kaleidoscope and the mirrors and everything else.
Thank you. And Olga has come to the rescue. So she says, regarding the hat, I think Ellington is wearing the Homburg hat.
Is it still the Homburg, the one the mover wears as well? Is that a Homburg with the raised crown? That's so interesting. Thank you, Olga.
Absolutely, thank you. And Omar also agrees the hat is indeed very interesting.
It is, and it's also, if all of these, the clips that I showed you, you can watch all of them on YouTube. And there's also, for those of you in the UK, Curzon Home Cinema has a package called Jazz, what's it called? Classic Jazz Shorts, that you can watch a whole selection of these. And I think Criterion Cinema, for those in the US, you can also watch them. But those two movers, the two comedians who play the movers, they also appear in Bessie Smith. And another man has that hat on. So clearly there's a passing around of accessories.
Absolutely. Another comment from Sophie, who says, wonderful play on shadows and the impact that makes. Again,
Yes,
so picking up on that.
Completely. And when you were talking yesterday about the shadows in the fashion photographs of the 1930s, it was really making me think of this. And I think it's so incredibly powerful, that final scene where the shadows make sense of the crowd of the Hall Johnson Choir, that you can't really make, because you've got the Hall Johnson Choir and some of Duke Ellington's orchestra mixed in together. So it's like this jumble of bodies and bits of musical instrument, which then becomes this, incredible elegiac lifting up to the heavens of shadows. And also the kind of shadowiness that room is no longer that kind of really sparse, poor room. It becomes this swelling focal point of emotion.
And you're absolutely right in your abstract, that real shift in emotion that comes in at the end, or you do sort of feel that pain, and it's a sudden change in mood.
Yes,
so striking.
Absolutely. And I think you do, there's in some of the other jazz films, I mean, the Bessie Smith one is very painful. It's very, she has the most horrible boyfriend, the best dressed but the worst boyfriend, who treats her appallingly, and that lament and her song and the way it swells is so moving. There's also another Duke Ellington one that has a 19-year-old Billie Holiday as a jilted lover, where again the music, the dress, the shadows, everything combined. And I think, yes, that final scene, and also how incredible it is that we're seeing it completely from Freddie Washington, that a Black woman is leading us, that a Black woman is taking us into her subjectivity, into her vision of the world, into her emotion through that, and the way that Duke Ellington's face dissolves at the end is just incredible.
Definitely. And Claire has asked, actually, speaking of viewpoints, did we ever see the audience?
The club audience, I guess you mean.
I think so.
No, you don't. I don't know that this is even, I think this is probably a stage set, not an actual club. So you don't. Obviously in the Bessie Smith and St. Louis Blues, they're integral. They're really integral to the narrative and to the music and to everything. But in this, it's completely focused on the performers.
Thank you. And Alison asks, do we know what the dance where the 5 dancers are in a very close line is called?
I don't know what the dance is called. That dance group is called the 5 Hot Shots, but I don't know what you call that dance, I'm afraid.
Thanks. And Oma says, oh, good idea. Is it possible the hat is an out of shape or possibly a self-styled Homburg?
Yes, possibly. Interestingly, there is a very lovely former student of mine, Imani Williford, wrote her dissertation on Barclay Hendricks' portraiture, and there's the same style of hat is worn by one of his subjects, and she didn't manage to find out the name of it. so it is this, because it is like a Homburg with the double dent. And maybe it is still just a Homburg, but which, as you say, has a particular style, but it does have a higher crown. And when you see it from sideways, it has like I don't know how to explain, it has like a little, like almost a little tail coming off at the top where the dent is. So it's quite, yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating. I love it anyway.
And Olga says, you mentioned a modern idea of masculinity embodied in the film, and can you comment a little more on it?
I mean, I think it's embodied by particularly Duke Ellington, but by his orchestra as well. And I would really I would refer to sort of Carol Tulloch's discussion of style narratives in her Birth of Cool book, I think, to explain what I mean with this, because I feel as though what he's conveying, I mean, he had a very middle class upbringing. He went to Pratt Institute. He's a very sort of cultivated man, and I think what he does through I think there's a stillness. It's quite interesting that he's playing this incredibly rhythmic and exciting music to move to, but I think there's a stillness to him and a kind of perfection to every detail of his dress, his hair, his moustache, which is inferring that kind of dandyish interest in detail, and that kind of dress which is both anonymous but also takes a lot to become that anonymous and that kind of perfect, because he's wearing clothing which was standard for men of this era, but he is kind of perfecting each detail. So I guess that was what I meant within that. And I think the film excuse me, is kind of an elegy to this kind of masculinity, that he remains calm throughout. He supports Freddie Washington. He's there for Freddie Washington. So I think it's a very interesting ideal of masculinity that's being projected.
Definitely, thank you. And Sophie adds, filming from underneath Freddie dancing must have been revolutionary for film techniques at the time. I
don't know if this is the first time it had been done. It's certainly quite incredible that this is 1929, and I think it is that kind of exciting moment where you have this kind of transnational movement of talent and influences and references going, from America to Europe, to Africa to Europe, and then back to America. So it's a kind of global coming together, if you like, which I think this film really depicts in a very, very exciting, visually lush. But I feel, I was trying to think how to describe it, because I think it's haptic looking, because I think you can kind of touch it, but it's also emotional looking. It's also this combination of hearing and seeing. So I think it's very rich. I think I went off tangent of what you actually asked me there, so I'm sorry.
And Beatrice added that she was looking a lot at the hands. Interesting point there.
Yes, Beatrice, absolutely. I don't know if this is what you're referring to. I mean, I think there's some beautiful hand movements. For me, it's the woman in the Hall Johnson choir when she holds up her hands as she sings is incredible. And I love the kind of drape that she's got, quite heavy silk or rayon, that it kind of weights and gives gravitas to that motion. I think also the hands of the 5 hotshots who are becoming the kind of secret stars of this talk. I think that you can see that the man at the front there must be something about how they keep in line in his hand movements, because you can see he occasionally taps the man behind him. So yeah, there's some very good hands.
There are. And Isha has a comment. The filming of Freddie from below up shot when she's spinning around really echoes the viewer to mimic what she must be feeling. Such clever techniques.
Yeah, no, it's really, and I think it's something else you said about how important contrasts are. I think when I first saw it and I first started watching it, I thought, oh, it's just going to be a bit of a clumsy comedy. And then suddenly you're plunged into this incredibly emotional, intense experience once you enter the club, which is so amazing. And I think that I really love Jacqueline Stewart's work on the ways that we can think about reception of film, because obviously we can't now interview people who may have watched this film, but she talks a lot about how we need to think about the experience for Black cinema goers in the 1920s, that they would often be, well, they would always be in a segregated space, whether it was an all-Black cinema or a cinema that was, that there was a section for Black people to watch, but also generally as cinema goers, the way that there's all these kind of personal things about how you're interacting with your space, the people you're with, how you feel, but then there's the intensity of being drawn in through the music, through the visuals, and through Freddie Washington's performance in this film as well to think about.
Absolutely. We are scheduled to have a break now. We have a few more comments. Are you happy to keep going for a few more minutes, Rebecca?
Yes, if everybody else is happy to have a slightly shorter break.
Okay, great. We've got half an hour, so I think we can afford a little bit of time. So Maya has said, I remember watching The Cotton Club as a young person and being absolutely fascinated by everything happening in that film. Watching this film as an interesting connection, as almost a parallel piece of information.
Yes, I mean, it's such, I haven't actually seen the film Cotton Club, I must confess. But I've been doing, because I should have probably said this is part of my research for my next book. So I've been looking at a lot of material and different kinds of material, and I think it's such a sort of fascinating space, and it's such a kind of contested space in that it's white-owned, but Black performers to a largely white, almost exclusively white audience, and that tension of who has the power within that space, whose gaze has the power, the potentially conflicting gaze, but also the kind of transcendence of performance and of artistry as well, that I think this film really conveys very strongly as a resistance to a refutation of kind of white dominance, white supremacy, racism. Obviously it's within a limited sphere, but I think it's incredibly intensely important as an example of that.
Definitely, thank you. And Alison also says, thank you, I love the 5 hot shots. I'm with Caroline. Me too. I'm with Caroline Evans, says Alison, who observes that the spinning dancer from underneath, a ballerina in this case, appears in René Clair's film Entr'acte from 1924.
Oh, that's so good to know. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And Claire says, in both films, there is a wonderful evocation of the support of community through their participation in the music, and even the audience. And the end of Black and Tan Fantasy reminded me of the heavenly angelic throngs of Christian painting, as well as the powerful, almost constructivist silhouettes that recalls the political demonstration. And she noticed that Freddie Washington's face on the pillow, now shadowed, reveals her Blackness.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yes. All of those points are really, really interesting. And I think there's a whole article written on the spiritual in this film, which obviously is was not my focus, but I think is a really important point. And that the way that Freddie Washington is lit, and on that it looks like it must be silk or a satin weave pillow, that incredibly detailed pillow that she's in is very much like Christian art of the time. Or not of the time, but Christian art generally.
Of course, wonderful. So that brings us to the end. We've got a few more lovely comments from Sophie, Olga and Beatrice. So really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we'll now have a break and we'll come back here at 12 o'clock to resume.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I would like to introduce Omar Asim and Maya Anton, who will be giving an industry presentation. Omar Asim is a Sudanese coiffeur working between Khartoum and London. His design process explores tangible and intangible cultural pursuits relating to dress, mind, and body. Modern shapes, cuts, and textures mixed with primitive elements to create a sense of regressive future. Maya Anton is a creative design strategist. Her practice straddles the areas of fashion, craft, and capacity building. Antoine also has a background in jewelry design with an MA from Central St. Martin's. She has worked as the lead creator for Omar Asim Women's Wear since 2010. Omar and Maya have worked together since 2010, and Omar has a background in architecture and psychoanalytic psychology, later moving into fashion. Maya trained as a jewelry designer and maker, and she has worked extensively on craft-based capacity building projects in Africa. Their work straddles craft, fashion, and other cultural pursuits, and their collaborative interest lies strongly in the process of making and in the space before an object is completed. They explore elements of traditional making techniques and have conversations around processes and the significance of discarded and hidden elements during the development of object or garment making. Their creative dialogue will explore what occurs before an object or garment is conventionally finished. They both grew up in Sudan and share an interest in the spaces in which objects are contextualized and made sense of. Though they work within the area of fashion, essentially they consider it an exploration of a space. For the audience, please feel free to submit questions and comments in the chat box at any time, and we'll get to them at the very end. Over to you, Maya and Omar.
Thank you. It is so good to be here. And we are quite excited to share with you the small, the short conversation that we are both going to have, and we would encourage anyone to join in, since this is how we work anyway. Our work is heavily based on conversations that we both have. We don't really work with themes or mood boards or anything like that. We just just rely heavily on conversations. So we would encourage anyone to can join in. Maya, if you wanna.
So yeah, we our main part of our practice is having very extensive conversations about areas of our practice that interest us. And one of the things that we decided that we would like to do today is maybe demonstrate part of how we do that. So this is going to be a conversation between Ahmed and I about a specific event that we experienced a few years back, which has also had a huge impact on ourselves personally, and it has an impact on how we now look at our work and how we are now moving forward as two creative practitioners who are always trying to find and understand our place in where we are today. So a few years back, shall I? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So a few years back, Ahmed and I were working with the British Council in the UK, and we were asked to do a piece of work. So we were going to go out to Sudan, where we grew up, but haven't spent that much time there since. And we were asked to do something around fashion and film. So we obviously thought about this extensively and what that would mean to us. And with the Sudanese political situation at the time, we felt extremely uncomfortable going to Sudan and shooting a conventional fashion film. So that was part of the issue that we initially were trying to have a conversation around, about what would be appropriate for us to do within that area. So when we did go to Sudan, after not having spent a lot of time there, due to both living in London, we then were faced with a lot of our own questions, and on terms of where we sit in the Sudanese context now as creatives and as people. And yeah, it was a very interesting 3 weeks, I think it was.
Yeah, about maybe 2 weeks, and then we went back again after a couple of months to follow up. But in the end, we just ended not really doing a fashion shoot as such. we have always been interested in clothes as modern artifacts. We ended up going to this house, which conjured up a lot of memories and maybe thoughts about how we perceive the past, past was like. We took with us a bag of clothes and some materials that we had.
They weren't random clothes though.
Yeah. And also some objects that didn't really make it to any of our final work, but we just always found them interesting, and we didn't really know how they sit with everything else, because we can't really present them as garments or finished objects, but we found them quite interesting.
So also leading up to us going to Sudan, we were having these conversations about the things that we were making and the objects that we were making and how they fit in into how would they fit in context within the Sudanese context, as well as two people who have a strong connection to Sudan. We didn't necessarily feel that we were making things as Sudanese creatives specifically, but then we were thinking about how our work fits into that context or to the larger context. So we weren't sure what we were going there to do as well.
Yeah, but that is also a common thread in our work and the way we do things. We never really plan anything. We because we both come from a makers and craft background. Maya is a jewelry maker, and I am trained as a pattern cutter. So we always just start work. We don't really plan anything, and
we have conversations about the themes that interest us, and that's how the work develops. And the work that we make is a continuous story. We don't tend to think about a conventional season by season approach to making things. And I think that's partly because we just fell into the mediums that we're using. I think what really interests us is exploring things. And it just so happens that I started my exploration into the things that interest me using the medium of metal, and I started that exploration using, fabric and clothing. And now we've realized that actually it's not necessarily fabric and clothing and jewelry that interest us. It's just a medium to explore the other bigger themes around our displacement that we are interested in.
Maybe now we can share with you some images of the work that came out of our visit there. So Maya is also a photographer. So she
I think that's another medium. I wouldn't call myself a photographer, but it's all these things that I use to explore what I'm thinking about. But
I think she's also the best person suited to photograph any of our work, because she knows which why, or she can see things like how we made them. I think this shoot I think started as a test, really, with light, and then it just became the final piece of work. If we can move to the next image, yeah. So that is basically the house, and we found it quite interesting because it's an unchanged house from the 60s, maybe. So it just captures a certain time and a certain perspective.
I think as well it was a bit of a time capsule also, in the sense of when someone leaves their country, and I think, you know, Ahmed and I are from the same generation of people who had to leave Sudan for different reasons. And when you leave a country, you leave almost with that time capsule in your head, in your perspective. And then going back to a country that has been going through a lot of turmoil since then, to come back to this place that's almost quiet and surreal was it was quite jolting for us to walk into this space, and it was almost walking into this quiet that we probably have in our heads in England, and then going back to it and opening up this time capsule and thinking, oh my God, there's so much that we haven't thought about, or we've put away in the kind of corners of our heads.
He can move to the next slide. And maybe now we can just move forward every 2 seconds, yeah. So we basically found that, like, I think one thing that I found quite interesting about this space is that it's it doesn't really make sense in many ways. It's quite disjointed. You find a sink and a fan and in a very odd place, and these are all old ways of doing things that have now become unfashionable. So you wouldn't really find a house in that still kept all of these practical things that they used to do, I think, back then, but now it's just very unfashionable.
I think what resonated with us about this particular space is that it actually, it's something that we clearly understood as a space, and it almost becomes like these particular things, the sink, the fan, they have a meaning of their own, because someone who has experienced that time in that space would directly, as soon as they saw it, would identify with it and understand it.
I think now we can maybe go through the I think slides.
So we started to play around with the space and use the space, instead of using an actual body as a person, to use the chairs and the other items in the space instead of a physical body.
Yeah.
Because there was this sense of the space that the body had left it, and that was something that kind of really struck us when we started to look at these photos, was that there was a very deep sense that there was people here that we connected with, and now they're not. So having actual physical bodies in the space wouldn't have made sense.
And also it's the sense that had these people been alive today, maybe they would have owned these.
Some of us are.
Yeah.
We're just not there.
Yeah. I think we shot there over 2 days, and it was quite an intense a 2-day shoot, especially since Maya had to come up with the goods and I didn't have to do much. So I think it just felt that I was putting her under a lot of pressure because we were not planning anything.
I think as well, we were also under emotional, under a lot of emotional pressure that we probably weren't even aware of. You know, we were going through this experience, and you know, these are homes that were multi-generational, that you and I have both interacted in these homes and have been part of that multi-generational home. And we are people who've come back who you know, were to some extent part of this, and there was a lot of dealing with who was there and what it felt like for us while we were there at that point, and now having gone away and come back. So I think, yeah, there was a lot of emotions that we weren't even aware until we went away and took a break, and then were able to come back and look at these photos. And I think we also didn't look at them straight away. We had to take a break and go away and have a sleep.
Maybe if we can just go through the images again, just to give everyone a chance to like in a loop sort of. Yeah. Thank you. I think the other thing worth noting is that the house was also empty, and we could just do whatever we wanted there. So I don't know if this shows in the photos, but it almost looks deserted, or maybe it feels like it's not really that the house has been closed for a long time, and maybe and this is probably evident in the dust that you see on some of the furniture. We were quite interested on the dust. I don't know if this comes through, but yeah. And then while we were there, a lady came looking for the house owners. So we asked her to sit down, and here she is.
And have a conversation with us.
And have a conversation. Yeah, it was. It was quite interesting. But maybe now we can go to the lookbook. So we thought maybe we'll share with you one of our lookbooks that resonates with what Lucy covers in her book. The lookbook was definitely not shot with with violence or Dali in mind. But I think what I find quite interesting about the lookbook is that it contains a lot of fragments, and these fragments, I think, they are not necessarily a bad thing. I see them in a positive light. From a maker point of view, when you make something, sometimes you don't know if people are seeing what you are seeing, so you need to maybe get a thing close up of the things that you worked hard on. And some of the things that we really work hard on is the shades of black. And maybe this is the one thing that unifies all of these fragments. If we can move forward, please. Yeah, thank you. So, and also the other thing that we always go back to is the objectification of the I think garments. If we can move forward, please. Yeah, thank you. I think we are quite interested in how a garment can not look like a fashionable piece of clothing, or maybe it shouldn't necessarily look like a piece of clothing at all.
I think we talk a lot about like the beauty of something and how we perceive beauty, in the sense of whether we try to avoid the prettiness of objects, and I think that's something that we should talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, yeah. If we can move forward, please. Thank you. Do you want to talk about that, Mai?
I think, yeah, I think that kind of ideal of beauty is something that we struggle with as well, and it's something that we take a lot of consideration of avoiding in the work that we do, and it's more about structure and about the beauty within the making, and the beauty within the harshness of things, the kind of unraveling of things, the fraying, the pieces that are unexpected, the parts of the garment that are unexpected, rather than just this whole pretty garment, if I'm making any sense.
Yeah, I think it's also the because we sometimes talk a lot about we have our own names for some of the pieces, and they're not necessarily conducive to a successful sales campaign. So we talk about them in a very harsh way.
They also take on a persona. These names give them a persona. The Death Eater dress, for example, is something that then gives it a life of its own, I think.
Yeah, and I think maybe these are the pieces that we always go back to, because we always try to, like with every season, we always start with the archives. If we can move forward, please. And we try to. I think we always end up pulling out pieces that have stayed with us for for some reason, and then we end up having these long conversations about them, and these conversations can then end up somewhere completely different. And then we have to come back to the actual garment again after 2 days, because we just went completely on a tangent.
Yeah, this is kind of what our practice looks like. We sit around with a garment and discuss it and drink a lot of tea and talk about how it makes us feel and how it makes the rest of the collection feel, and it kind of grows from there. We tend to go back to the archives and think about pieces that haven't been, you know, we haven't discussed enough, we haven't thought about enough, and build upon that. And there's always things that, you know, that we keep going back to, and then there's things that get lost that, you know, we can not talk about for 2, 3, 4 years, and then it'll resurface as something that now has value because of, you know, for example, an experience like going to Sudan, and then thinking, okay, you know, we made those things previously, we need to bring them back out and have that discussion, because now is when they're starting to fit in more. It was a thought and we put it to rest, but now is the time to bring it back out.
Forward again, please. Sorry, I don't have control. Grace is kindly helping me with that because we were experiencing some technical reasons. Forward again, please. And again, please. And again. And again, please. Can we, I think, zoom in on this one, please?
It's not possible to zoom in, unfortunately, Emma.
Yeah. Okay.
Everybody have a closer look.
Yeah. And if we can also move forward again, please. Yeah. This piece is a piece that we always go back to, and I think it started as a way of cutting a garment in a way to deflect away any sense of sexuality, and to just like clean a garment in a way that it doesn't have any gender or any but in the end it just ended up having a complete opposite effect, and it became the one piece that most of our clients want to have. So yeah, if we can move forward again, please. And again, please. And again. And again, please. Yeah. I think this is probably a good shot to show what I mean about color and focusing, because we spend a lot of time choosing a texture or a shade of black, and we have a summer black and a winter black, brown black, blue black, and I think this probably only matters to us more than anything else, because unfortunately in the end we realize that it just ends up being clean black to the outside the viewer, but it's something that we insist on keeping.
We have an intense obsession with shades of black, and sometimes I think it runs away with us, and we're easily sidetracked by the textures and the layering of textures, and you can't really see this in this photograph, unfortunately, but the skirt is a wool that has its own texture. The corset is wood, the fringe is, so all of these layers of textures are really something that for some reason is quite important to us. And
I think also the other thing that we work hard at is to escape the gaze. So we always have this tension between wanting attention, but also not too much attention, because the gaze can be quite intrusive. So I think this is what we always try to balance.
I think it's also an interest between like what we consider, like what different people consider as attractive or sexy, and I think that's another conversation that we always have as to which parts of the body we feel are the ones that we want to highlight in a garment, or the ones that as a woman there's a conventional idea of what women would like to feel or would like to see shown in their bodies, and then there's possibly a completely different reality. I personally don't like wearing things that are above the knee, and so there is that conversation as to what we like to cover and uncover, and how much we like to cover and uncover, and the areas of the garment that we where the windows of the gaze are as well.
I think we are probably over time, so we should probably stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar and Maya. That was so fascinating. I loved looking at the images. And I see that the audience members also share in this sentiment. So I'm going to just start posing the questions from the beginning. I think, well, you showed two bodies of work. So I wanted to start by just asking you about how you played with draping and composition for the images. I think you kind of mentioned that with the playing with the black, but then, in the first series where there are no bodies, how did you, drape and then kind of make things stay, or how did you create the compositions of these wonderful images?
I think that's a really good question, because a lot of it comes from spending a lot of hours in that space, and really kind of, you guys got a very edited version of a shoot that went on and on, and I think it's also something that we consider within the clothing. There's a lot of draping and consideration of draping within the garments that we make, whether on or off the body, and we're also always quite interested in how the garment sits on its own as an object. So even within the making of garments, we like the idea of when garments are hung on, even if they're in a shop, how do they look to the viewer, and what's going to draw you in to that. So within that specific shoot, I think it was also an idea that we could play with that. How do garments look on their own as objects?
I think I should probably add that that doesn't really mean that we are not talking about the hanger appeal for sales, because most of the times they just look completely flaccid, but it's the way that they are it's bodiless that probably it matters most to us. So yeah, I think the main thing to say is that we are not really talking about the sales hanger appeal.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think, you know, this kind of ties a lot of the questions together. Beatrice asked, you know, how do you cope with the uncertainty? And I remember, you know, talking about things like being sidetracked, or like, you know, spending a lot of time, you know, talking or trying things out. Do you find that not knowing where things are going is liberating or sometimes stifling? I'm not sure what is your take on this.
Terrifying, mostly.
I think Maya probably finds it more difficult to deal with than me. I find it a lot easier. I am quite. I quite like when you go into anything without any plan and you just see where things take you, because I think it just leaves a space for mistakes and serendipity, and also I think it's also a bit therapeutic.
I think that's, for me, like, I will say something that I've really learned from working with Ahmed. Yeah, it's quite stressful and sometimes I do get quite anxious and I'm like, we don't have a plan, what are we going to do? However, that idea that you can work with somebody who's like, it's okay, you know, if it goes wrong, because when I first started working with Ahmed and he would ask me to, you know, try something out or think about something, and I was just like, oh my God, if I get it wrong or if it doesn't work. And I think that's something that's really important within a creative practice, that the mistakes are what have brought us all of this way. And they're the interesting things about what's going on. There's obviously anxiety towards kind of like meeting deadlines and meeting, you know, because of the way we work is so fluid. And so, yeah, there is some really positive aspects to it and some really kind of hair-raising aspects of it.
I hear that. And, you know, is there some kind of a loose structure that you start with? So Rebecca's asking, you know, do you, could you comment on how you choose the garments to bring with you? And, you know, how do you have a starting point when everything is so free?
Yeah.
I love going with instinct. And that doesn't always agree with me, because I'm like, you know, if we love it, let's just go with that. We don't have to really overthink this as much. Sometimes I'm the overthinker, sometimes Ahmed is the overthinker. But I think we always go back to the archives and we kind of try and have a day where it's just me and Ahmed in the studio, no one else. And it's a day that's set apart as a relaxed kind of, let's see where this goes. And then we start picking things out and we start having a conversation. And I do a lot of trying things on. I'm like I play dress up in the studio so much. And this is something that also connects to Sudan and growing up. I used to spend hours as a child in front of a mirror when people were taking their afternoon naps, dressing up, stealing things from my sister's closets, trying them on and layering these ideas. And this is something that Ahmed and I do a lot. I know it sounds bizarre, but I play dress up and we discuss this situation that's happening and we play with, you know, fabric and garment, and then that brings us to this, okay, maybe we should try this, and then it will then either go to a shoot or it will go to kind of cutting and starting to think about fabrics. And it's quite a long therapy based conversation / process.
I think this leads very well into Leah's question. Leah's commenting that it is so fascinating to hear about the role of conversation in your practice. And it seems like it started in childhood. And she's wondering whether you could say a bit more about how you perceive the relation between your garments and the wearer's body, perhaps not specifically your own Maya, but like the people who are going to buy and wear your garments, Omer.
Yeah. That's a very good question because I actually use Maya's body as a way to experience what it feels like to be in these clothes that I don't fit in. So we are always talking about how she feels in them and how low the pockets should be, how long the lining will be comfortable. So I experienced them secondhand through her, I think.
And in terms of the outside of our experience, the other women or men who wear our clothes, I think that's something that we are conscious of and we do talk about. But then once you make something and you send it out into the world, you don't really have that much control over what happens to it. And so it's always difficult to try and control that, and we try and stay away from that, because I think part of what we do is not just the individual clothes, it's the overall idea of layering and how you think about your clothing and how you think about your body and how much you buy. There's a lot more within our personal conversation that we can't really put on to other people who then buy into the brand.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're quite conscious of trying to maybe stay away too much from thinking about what other people should do with these clothes or how they should use them, because I think that can then lead us to be a bit like, no, we don't want that to happen. We want it to be like this, and you can't control that. So I think we do have conversations about that, but we try not to get too involved in that maybe.
Yeah, I think that came through in your presentation. I'm reading lots of positive comments about the work that you've shown. So for example, Lucy says that she loves your consideration of the gaze and the conflict between attention and protection, and the idea of how to use fashion to both display and hide parts of the body. And then Rebecca commented that your use of shades of black and textures of black is really very beautiful and adds extra dimension to the silhouettes and forms you create. And that leads me to another question, which is, I hear what you're saying, that you don't really want to dictate, I guess, what the wearer is, how the wearer wears your clothes or feels in your clothes. But Janine is asking, by labeling the item so specifically, like the Death Eater dress, for example, is your intention to provoke a type of feeling in the wearer?
That's our personal nickname for the dress in the studio.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily go out to the world with that name attached to it.
Yeah.
Because there's so many items in our archive, and they are 90% of them are black. So if Irma calls me up, and we do have a lot of conversations over the phone and like this, so he'll say to me, the black dress, and I'm like, okay, yeah, which black dress? And then he'll be like, the black dress from 17 spring summer 17, and I'm like, no, I don't know that black dress. So just because of that, they tend to then pick up nicknames. So, I can remember, he's in the studio more than me looking at the clothes. So then to just have these quick descriptions, it's just a personal joke that has happened within the studio.
Yeah.
I think the shorthand that you use definitely comes through in this presentation as well. Thank you so much for a really fascinating look into your practice together. And round of applause online for everyone. And
thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Now I'd like to hand over to Lucy to introduce the next presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for sharing your incredible work with us. That was just fascinating, and so many different concepts and themes are really kind of speaking to what we're exploring in this conference. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you. Really wonderful session. And now I'm really pleased to introduce to you Hilda Burke and Dion Taylong, Dr. Dion Taylong, two practicing psychologists. So a real treat to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. And as usual, I invite the audience to ask any questions or make any comments in the chat box as we're speaking. So it's a really valuable opportunity to try and really underpin why some of these relationships between fashion and trauma and violence are happening, as if using psychology to help us do that. So I'm going to ask you both some questions and really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on these themes. Before I start, I'd like to introduce you both with your bios. So Hilda Burke is a West London-based integrative psychotherapist and writer working with clients in a broad range of subjects, including anxiety, bereavement, infertility, addiction, abuse, and depression. She is author of the Phone Addiction Workbook. She studied at CCPE and holds diplomas in psychotherapy and couples counselling, as well as a postgraduate certificate in dream work, validated by the University of Northampton. She's also a frequent speaker and press contributor. Dr. Dion Terlong is a chartered and practicing psychologist working in the areas of educational psychology and fashion psychology, the latter in which she lectures, provides media comment and conducts research, as well as running the Style and Wellbeing Consultancy, which supports people in their style identity during periods of change. She is currently researching the link between clothing and mood. So thank you so much for both being here again. Welcome. So to kick us off, I'd like to ask you, it's quite a broad question, but how do you feel fashion allows us to express ourselves? So how can it reveal ourselves, our experiences, or even how we would actually like to be perceived?
Feels a bit rude. It's like, who should start, isn't it?
Dion, your letter comes before mine, so I think you should.
Well, that's nice. Alphabetical. Like, how does fashion express ourselves? It's actually a big question, isn't it? And it is broad. And it's a really multi-pronged, I think, a thing to consider. And I guess we can use fashion, and when we say fashion, I guess I'm thinking about personal style more so. We use it to express so many elements of ourselves. So we might use it to express our social economic status, our musical tastes, our cultural backgrounds, our affiliations. When you say that, for me, kind of skate culture comes to mind as well, you know, and all these brands that have built themselves on skate culture. And I guess, you know, it's through fashion that we're able to continuously work and rework our identities over time, and we can kind of like try on these different outfits, almost like they're different skins and personas that we're taking on and trying out. So I think, you know, fashion is a really helpful tool for us to be able to express ourselves, whether that be, you know, something more integral and central to our identity, or whether it's just on a day-to-day basis to express how we're feeling at any given time or on that day. I'm sure we've all had days where you've woken up and you don't really want to work and you're a bit of a funk, so you put on like your big slouchy jumper and your joggers and you say, this is me today. And that's one way that we can express ourselves, and there's so many ways.
Yeah, I like what you said there, Dion, at the start about, you know, sort of that fashion, you know, being style rather than fashion, because, you know, I think fashion can impede us from expression. That can limit us, because, you know, fashion is I Googled it earlier to make sure my interpretation was correct, but it's a popular or latest style. So it's kind of, it's already sort of, okay, what's in? You know, and what do I choose within that? So I think fashion can be really unhelpful as a way, because we're already going, oh, is this in or out? Rather than, does this express me? Does this feel right for me? Is this, you know, does it suit me aesthetically? Does it suit me emotionally? Like you said, you just want to put on a sloppy jumper and joggers. So I think, you know, fashion can be sort of conformity if we follow that rigidly. Of course, there are shades, and we can make a style our own, of course, but I think clothing, apparel can, in its broadest sense, can be a way, a helpful way of self-expression. When I was kind of musing on this topic during the week, one of my favorite RuPaul quotes came to me. There are a few. We are all born naked and the rest is drag. So, you know, we're blank canvases, and everything, whether we wear the most sort of blending into the crowd clothing, you know, it's a deliberate effort to say something about ourselves. We want to be invisible, we want to be like everyone else, you know, so it's quite deliberate, these these identities we put on, like you said, Deanne, through our clothing, these signifiers, what we're symbolizing, what it's saying about us. And whether it's like, don't look at me, I'm the same as everyone else, or look at me, I'm very different to everyone else, you know, I want to stand out, and shades in between, of course, we can do a little bit of both. But I think, yeah, the distinction between fashion and clothing, I think is for me is an important one.
I like what you said there, sorry, about, you know, using clothing being kind of invisible. And when I was reading that, you know, thinking about this as well, I was thinking about using clothing almost like a veil, and the way that you can use it to show or to disguise certain parts of yourselves, and the way that we might choose to show or hide certain parts of ourselves in different situations, and the way we use clothing to do that. So for example, in a job interview, where we kind of I was almost like distort ourselves to try to fit into that ideal candidate mold, and then we hide parts of ourselves. Then often we see that, you know, when you're more vulnerable or you're more relaxed, the veil begins to drop and we show more of ourselves. You know, there's certain things you'll wear in certain situations around people that you're more familiar with,
right,
that you wouldn't wear around other people, because you're hiding and showing elements of yourself. And it's, yeah, that reminded me of that when you said about the invisibility.
Well, thank you both so much. Incredible responses. I think what you've just explained, Dion, it really resonates again with what we just had in the previous session with Maya, so this idea of sort of hiding or displaying, whether that's parts of our bodies or even parts of ourselves, our identities, and the way we adapt that for different situations, as you mentioned. So really, really fascinating. And Hilda, I really like the distinction that you're making between sort of dress and clothing or fashion. I think it's really useful to establish that. I was wondering, Dion, whether you had any thoughts on that. Is that something that comes up in your consultancy and your practice, this distinction between sort of clothing and dress or style versus fashion?
It's something that it doesn't come up from clients so much, but it comes up from myself. And I think particularly, I don't know if Hilda finds the same thing, but in work, when you're discussing matters maybe with other academics or with students, and you feel you need to make that distinction, because yeah, when I think of fashion, I think of high fashion, and I think of trends, and I think, like Hilda said, you know, you think of being told what's in and out and told what to wear. It's not about the individual as much. It's not about our lived experiences. And I think as psychologists and psychotherapists, that's what we're more so interested in. So I think I often make that distinction to help the person think about themselves as an individual, to increase a sense of agency, to make them realize this is something you can opt in or out of. You can pick and choose what you want and have that control. Fashion is not something that is done to you. It's not something that's dictated. It's something you can make of yourself, and that's style. Yeah. And I think that's yeah. So I think that distinction is very important.
Thank you. Another quite big question, big idea here, but I'm really fascinated to hear sort of your thoughts based on your practice. But what are some of the ways in which fashion or style or dress or clothing, how do they operate and affect us psychologically? So can they actually change how we feel or change how we feel about ourselves?
Yeah, I think so. I remember when I used to, a long time ago, I used to work in public relations, and I remember if I was doing a pitch, I would always wear a red suit. I think maybe I'd read, I don't know whether I'd read somewhere, red is a vibrant color, it makes people look at you and pay attention, or I found that through my own experience. But I felt when I put on that red suit, I couldn't be invisible. I had to kind of go for it and have something to say. So it really kind of pushed me. I really felt empowered by that red suit. Actually, it wasn't even my red suit. It was a friend's red suit that I used to borrow. We used to swap clothes a lot. So I think there are certain kind of, it's like a superhero outfits that we have. And I can think of mine for, you know, for different occasions, you know, fail-safes, go-tos, that I feel a certain way when I put on those clothes. But I think that, but in a way, I think maybe when we're reaching, I speak from my experience, when we're kind of reaching for something, we need that item of clothing more. Like when I started working as a psychotherapist, I was very kind of aware of looking the part and, you know, kind of what does a psychotherapist wear? Not that I bought anything different or bought anything that wasn't me, but I would certainly style those clothes or put them together in a little bit of a certain way. And I think now, because I feel more confident in my work and I've got a stream of clients. Back then when I was trying to get clients, I think I dress more of a way, whereas now I wear what I want. I really, you know, obviously within, you know, with certain boundaries, but by and large, I kind of wear what I want. And I think the more comfortable we feel within that, whether it's a date or whether it's work or whether it's a business meeting, the more comfortable we feel in that scenario that we have something to offer, the more options I feel in how broad the palette becomes that we choose from. Whereas when we want to be seen as an attractive person or a trusted serious psychotherapist, or, you know, someone you want to do business with, someone you want to listen to, then I found that it becomes a bit restrictive. We start to kind of getting into role, and it becomes a costume rather than just this is how I feel today, and this is how I want to turn up.
So interesting hearing you say that. And I was thinking about when I first qualified as well, and the fact that I used to, if I was doing a consultation or a meeting, if I forgot my glasses, I felt like then I wasn't a psychologist, and they'd say, she's not a psychologist, wear her glasses. Now I wear them because I need them to see. Back then my eyes were a little bit better, but I felt like the mask had slipped if I didn't have those on. Mm-hmm. And there was something about, like you said, the costume nature of dress and the way we use it. And I think it's that putting your best foot forward, or trying to show people, this is who I am, this is my capability. And you feel like you have to present this certain image of yourself that fits this mold that is one of capability. This is what a capable person looks like. And this is not what one looks like. And like you said, Hilda, it's not until you're more comfortable in yourself, in your practice, that you may feel you're able to slip away from that, or challenge that, or let go of those almost crutches that we use. Yeah, very interesting.
Super interesting. Thank you both. Then moving on to, what have you noticed about the connections that there are between fashion, beauty, style, and mental health or well-being? What's come up for you both, maybe in your practice, with your clients? Or is this something that comes up regularly?
I think for me, what I've noticed is I used to, while I was doing my doctorate, I decided I wasn't busy enough. So I was working in training as a stylist, which was very busy and silly idea. But what I noticed particularly then actually was the comments people made, is the way people speak about themselves in relation to fashion, that I find quite hard to take. It's that really negative, insidious, negative self-talk. So I'd be working with clients and they would say things to me like, I remember one client saying to me, I need to find a dress for my birthday, but it has to cover my arms. So my family don't comment on my horrible big arms. And I remember thinking, you know, I want to do so much more with you right now than just find you a dress. There's so much more going on here that we need to attend to. And then later on, as a psychologist, you know, I still hear the same negative self-talk. And also in regard to fashion, what I notice is the way people feel excluded. And we have to bear in mind, I think, that a lot of fashion functions on exclusivity and painting an image of who it's for. But by painting an image of who it's for, you're also saying who it is not for. And I've had people that I've been working with, and I'll say, okay, let's think about your style. Let's look at this brand, or let's think about, could you wear this? And they'll say, oh, well, that's not for me. And it's that line I've heard more than once, it's not for me. And when they say that, they don't mean, it's not something that I would like to wear, or I would choose to wear. It's that feeling of being chosen, or being seen as that it has been created with you in mind. It's almost like the door is already shut on that avenue. And it just feels really sad to see that the fashion world has, maybe deliberately or maybe not deliberately, left people feeling excluded in this way. When it should be for everybody, of course.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, Dion. There's I was reading a profile. It was, who was it? Chloe, new designer of Chloe. I can't remember her name. I think she's French Lebanese or French North African. Anyway, that was maybe a year or two ago. Maybe she's no longer the designer, Chloe. But they asked her, you know, who do you design for? And she's like, oh, you know, she's about 30. She's got a PhD in science-based something. I was like, what? I know a lot of friends who have PhDs in science and they don't have Chloe budgets. You know, I mean, I think kind of fantasy, you know, why not say, you know, I'm dressing for Russian billionaires' daughters. You know, that's probably more true.
Be honest.
But she wants to create this fantasy. I think fashion does that a lot. They're not like, okay, this is for an escort maybe. And, you know, why not? But, you know, I think there's a lot of bullshit in fashion about, you know, who maybe it would be lovely to have a PhD of 30 who's just graduated and has the budget for Chloe and couture. But I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think fantasy is a big part of fashion, and we all like to fantasize. We all like to kind of put on something that makes us feel like something else occasionally, to take a little break from ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that in itself. But I think sometimes the kind of peddling that goes on is just, I don't know, kind of baffling to me about, you know, what world do you think this is? Or an NGO worker, you know, who's really empowered and working with women in the third world. They're probably not buying your clothes, sorry, but, you know, it's, I don't know. I think stuff like that really kind of amuses me, you know. But I don't know. Sometimes I'd like to kind of, you know, I think Versace, you know, I kind of grew up in the 90s and I loved the aesthetic of the supermodels. They were gorgeous and, you know, beautiful kind of flashy clothes. But I think, you know, there was a bit more honesty then about maybe who they were designing for. But I think it's kind of trying to kind of speak about inclusivity as a kind of an idea, but not really. There's a disconnect, you know, who can afford the clothes? You know, really, who can afford these clothes? Yeah, so it's going to limit, it is going to make it, like you said, Dion, non-inclusive by the very nature of the stores and the intimidation, even if you have the money, maybe, you know, I think there is that barrier that to make it feel exclusive, but yet they want to be inclusive of different genders, races, sizes, you know. I think the whole nature of the beast is quite exclusive.
Yeah. But then it leaves people feeling, you know, what's wrong with me, or what am I doing wrong? Why I am not 30 with a PhD and able to shop at Chloe.
Right.
And it's straight away, then you start questioning yourself. You think, okay, and then people, you know, it does, you said that it provides that fantasy. So you want that little piece of that life. And the only way you can attain that little piece of that life is maybe you can afford maybe a hairband from Chloe, or maybe a tiny little purse at the best. And you think, okay, I've got a little bit of that lifestyle. And almost like you're taking it on yourself. But yeah, they really are sometimes selling this kind of slightly unattainable, unrealistic dream, and it's not necessary. Like I said, the 90s was not a great time for fashion, but a little more honest, brutally honest maybe, but
yeah, inclusivity it's extremely important, and this idea of, you know, being excluded, that must have really detrimental psychological effects. And is that something you've noticed, that the fashion world or style in general has that had some negative psychological effects for your clients that you talk with?
Negative, I would say I see a lot with older generations, not older, but kind of millennial upwards. I think we're still seeing the overhang of what you described there, Hilda, about from the 90s, where we were pushed these fashions that were designed for these kind of waif-like bodies, and there was such a focus on bodies, in particular the female body, in fashion magazines, with them commenting, calling out, and who's hot, who's not, who wore it best, this continuous competition, and then putting people in competition with their own bodies when they're fighting, why are you not how I want you to be, why do you not look how I should look? And I think what I'm still seeing is the overhang from that, with people with diet culture, they're still so pervasive, with disordered eating patterns, and just this kind of negative relationship to the body I still see. But and then with slightly younger generations, like maybe younger millennials and Gen Z, then rather than it being kind of like high-end fashion they're looking to, or fashion magazines, or social media. And while there are like so many positive benefits of social media with showing a broader range of people from different backgrounds, of different socioeconomic status, of different body sizes, of all of these, different backgrounds. But rather than just looking at and comparing yourself to your friends or to the latest runway show, which there were only maybe like 4 a year for each season, now it's day in, day out, and there's no escaping it because it's in your hand, at your fingertips. And it's not just comparing yourself to your friends or people at your school, but it's the world, because now, our social groups are so much bigger. You can have friends all around the world, or, social media connections, and it's a continuous comparison, the social comparison. But I would say on the flip side, there are positives to that, aren't there? With fashion, like I think particularly if you think about teens, and when you're a teenager and you're going through those stages of finding your identity and you're exploring, I think, like I said before, I think fashion is really, really fantastic for allowing you to explore and to try on these different personas, to say, okay, this is me, this is not me, I feel comfortable in this is not me anymore, I've outgrown this. And I think, I'm not a fan of fast fashion at all, and I think it does horrendous things for the environment, and don't get me started on like workers' conditions in the garment factories. However, I'm just thinking back to the 90s and times where we didn't have that kind of more affordable fashion, which meant that if you were a young person trying to explore your identity, it was a lot trickier. You had to rely on hand-me-downs, or have a family, or charity shops, or have a family and come from a background that would allow you to shop in Tammy Girl and BHS or Miss Selfridge at the time. And if you didn't have that money, it was a lot harder. But now you can pick up clothing for such little money, which is in itself horrendous. However, in terms of psychological well-being for the individual and exploring your own identity, especially for a teenager with limited funds, can also be very helpful. It's both.
Interesting. Thank you, Dion. And I think you're quite right. It is something that we need to consider, and this idea of sustainability, as well as the exclusivity versus inclusivity. And it's interesting that you're both sort of looking back to, say, the 90s and now. And so maybe there are some positive changes and still more positive changes to be made, but then we have more negative ones as well, such as fast fashion. So really important considerations. And to add to that, I was wondering, what are some of the most common issues that clients come to you with sort of regarding the body or style or fashion?
I think, Dion, you probably have more experience in this. I think in my work, it's less overt. I mean, I do have a few clients who are stylists, and they will sometimes speak about the struggle, with certain clients, or a certain client wants to look a certain way for a photo shoot and they can't fit into the sample size, and there's this kind of, there's often a standoff, and kind of agents get involved, and it's very sort of complex, the whole sort of dance and egos and labels and designers, and so I've had some sort of insight into that world, which I wouldn't otherwise have, but it's a bit less personal. It's more of a work issue for them than a kind of a personal body or fashion issue. I guess what I would say is, I think it's during lockdown, it was less of a thing, because people weren't going out, or they weren't socializing, they weren't dating, or they weren't going for, well, they were going for job interviews, but they weren't thinking of the whole package. So it was kind of waist up, obviously. So I think people took it was less of a consideration at that time. Certainly, you speak for myself, I probably lived in the same pair of leggings for about a year. So I think a lot of people put that on hold, certainly in my client base. So I think it's maybe, people are maybe, when I think about my clients and how they kind of present, whether it's online or offline or in real life, when I see them, there is definitely more of thought and consideration going into how they present compared to those 2 years that we've just come out of, where it just seemed to be, well, it's all at home and dressing for yourself, which is often dressing for comfort. So yeah,
I'd agree with Hilda, and I'd say so just quickly on what do I see in clients. I think often I see people struggling to marry up different parts of themselves. So I kind of maybe thinking about their work style or their work persona, and then their casual, or, you know, and trying to figure out, okay, this is who I am in the office, this is who I am outside. But now I end up with these two very separate fragmented wardrobes. And what do I do if I want to go after work? And these kind of things. Or it might be, you know, I had people, you know, they've retired and they said, I spent my whole life being this occupation, this is who I was, and now I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not sure who I am, so I'm not sure how to dress for this new self. But I think just picking up on what Hilda said there about the pandemic, and I think I massively agree with you there. And I love the dressing from the waist up bit. It's so funny. But I think we were seeing a lot more of people kind of being free in their style, and being less boundaried in terms of the abiding by the do's and the don'ts, and focusing a lot more on, well, this is what I'm comfortable in, and focusing on comfort as well, and taking more risks, and realizing that, you know, people before were kind of afraid to repeat the same outfit more than once. Oh, I've been seen wearing this, I can't wear it again. And we all learned during the pandemic that, you know, you can wear the same outfit a good few days in a row and the world does not fall apart. Nobody cares. And I think it almost put us into this kind of cold turkey and forced us to reflect on how we engage with fashion and with clothing. And it, you know, got us to try out these different ways of dressing. You know, what happens if I wear joggers all the time? What happens if I wear the same thing? What happens if I stop dressing for other people and I just put on whatever I feel like? And I think it really gave people a chance to explore and to experiment a little bit. And I think, yeah, that's been a very positive thing in terms of fashion that's come out of a very horrible situation, which was the pandemic.
Oh, thank you both. It's super, super interesting, especially to consider the effect of the pandemic and the lockdowns. It's really interesting. I wonder now if we can turn to maybe discussing some studies, some psychological studies that have sort of investigated the link between fashion and psychology. So I'm thinking of Adam and Glinsky's concept of enclothed cognition from 2012. So I wonder, could you tell us a little bit more about that, or any other kind of relevant studies you've come across?
That's all right, that's me. So that study is one that's often picked up, I'd say. So the Adam and Glinsky study, looking at enclothed cognition, I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are familiar with it. They basically did this lab coat study where they had a white long coat, and they told, you know, one group of participants that it belonged to a painter or an artist, and one group of participants that it belonged to a scientist or a doctor. And then they had them do a number of tasks to look at their sustained attention, directed attention, problem-solving capabilities. And they basically found that the people who wore the coat that they believed belonged to a scientist consistently performed better. And then they came along, they coined this term enclothed cognition to show that it's not that when you wear an item of clothing that has symbolic meaning, that you're more likely to take on the traits that you associate with the item of clothing, and therefore it affects you psychologically. And you have to wear it, because they showed that, you know, if the coat that belongs to a scientist is just hanging up in the room and you look at it but don't wear it, it doesn't have the same effect. It's almost like you're taking on the traits of that garment. There are lots of studies like that, actually. And I think one of my favorite ones is the swimsuit study. And now I've forgotten who it's by, which is not very helpful, but there's a swimsuit study. And what they did is they had two groups of women and a group of men, and they got them to complete a maths task while either wearing swimwear or wearing their normal clothing. And what they found is that women, when they are completing the maths task wearing swimwear, performed far worse than any other condition. But men, when they were wearing swimwear or wearing their normal clothing, didn't differ too much. They weren't fazed by having to sit there in a Speedo or whatever they were wearing, whereas women were massively so. And then for me, what it just demonstrates is how much cognitive effort is directed in the wrong direction when you're wearing something that you're not comfortable in. How much cognitive effort is taken up by this internalized male gaze that women have, compared to men who were fine pretty much wearing whatever. And it just shows that it literally had an impact on their cognitive performance. I think that's, you know, I think about the implications for students in school when they're sitting exams or they're doing their work, and you think about they're sat there maybe wearing clothing they're not comfortable in. They think about school uniforms or I don't know, being sexualized at a young age, and just the impact that has on a person, not in terms of just their emotional well-being, but literally their cognitions.
It's really interesting. I didn't know. I mean, I knew when you were talking about women wearing, I knew already. I could imagine
where it was going.
but I never heard it. It's really interesting. I think like Steve Jobs apparently wore the same turtleneck because he knew this, that it would be too distracting. Oh, what Steve? Not that people, lots of reasons people don't care what men wear, but at the same time he knew that there would be some form of distraction, and I think Obama as well used that knowledge, and he wore the same suit. And there's this, I think there was a newscaster in Australia for a year wore exactly the same navy suit, and no one knows. So it, I guess if the clothing is neutral and the person feels very comfortable in it because they know it, they wear it every day, then what they say, what they do is very, that's the focus, rather than, oh, is that what's that print on that tie today? Well, they've seen it a million times, so they don't need to focus on, it makes sense. It really makes sense. But then again, do we want to? I don't know, because what we say is, I think is 7% of what we communicate. So a lot is our body language, what we're wearing, what we look like, everything. So I guess if you neutralize all those elements, have them as a constant, every day I look the same because I'm wearing the same suit in the same way, then probably that 7% becomes, it increases, what they say becomes much bigger part of what they're communicating, because there's no other cues for us to our minds to latch on to.
Thank you both, really critical ideas there. And I'd like to turn now to sort of really address some of the themes that have been coming up so far in the conference. So I wonder what you can both tell us about what you think fashion serves as. So can it serve as psychological protection or comfort or armor? Can it help us through difficult times or help us to process negative experiences such as trauma or violence? What do you both think?
Let you go ahead, Hilda, if you wish.
That's a funny question at all. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and the answer is I'm not sure at all, because I'm thinking of one client I saw in the past who had been quite a successful model, and she was a beautiful girl, conventionally beautiful figure and everything, but very, very self-conscious about how she looked. And I guess she was slim, but I guess in the modeling world she wouldn't have been considered the slimmer side. She would have been big probably, even though by anyone else's estimation she was very slim. So she always wore like really, really sloppy things and really kind of obscured her looks, because I think she had while working as a model, she had so much poking at her, measuring of her, assessment of her, judging of her physicality, that she didn't wear any makeup. She didn't, it's fine to wear no makeup. It's fine to wear sloppy clothes, but it was a reaction, I think, to what she had experienced in her work as a model. And I think, insofar as, I've other clients who have worked, their body has been their work. I've a couple of clients who worked as escorts, and they, even though they weren't doing that at the time, they were still very much dressed in a very body conscious way, in a way. And I guess that was just the way they'd gotten used to dressing. And even though they weren't doing in that line of work anymore, there was still that, they presented, very much in a body conscious, body exposing way, kind of showcasing their bodies. So, so in both cases, both had kind of used their body was their work. That's how they earned money in the different ways, whether it was sex work or modeling. But one really hid all that, whereas some of the other girls, women, they were very still dressing as if they were in that line of work. So it's kind of an interesting contrast, but I guess you could say that the women who worked as escorts, it was a different dynamic. I guess maybe they had more, I don't know, it's hard to say, but the models seem to have had more of a negative experience of her physicality as a result of her work. You know, it's hard to generalize. These are kind of small numbers, and I don't, Dion, you probably have more sort of an informed research kind of led opinion on you know, what the impacts are for kind of working with your body or having experienced violence to your body, and how that impacts, you know, how we present, how we dress. But yeah, for me, it's more, I only kind of know this sort of anecdotally from people I've worked with, so I can't really give much more of a broader opinion on that.
That's really interesting though, and it's got my brain worrying. I was thinking, I wonder what the difference is between the models and the escorts. Just thinking, I'd love that. Just feels very interesting example. I can't think of any particular kind of research that comes to mind at the moment, but I was thinking about another anecdote when you asked Lucy about, you know, how fashion can support us, like our psychological processes and comfort and armor. And I was thinking about just what we talked about a moment ago with enclothed cognition, and the way that can be helpful in that, I guess, and the way Hilda also spoke about wearing the red suit, was it for work? And that is a form of kind of that sartorial armor, isn't it? And the way, you know, if you are experiencing like low mood or having a tricky time, the way that, you know, holding on to or wearing an item of clothing that belonged to a loved one can really help you to feel that little bit more comforted or protected, or even, you know, wearing something that reminds you of somebody that you look up to, admire, or you think is powerful, can make you also feel that way and feel like you're channeling them, and that way it can kind of serve as an armor. During the first lockdowns, I was doing an interview for an MSc student for a project, and they were, you know, just talking, and I got to hearing that they hadn't been able to go home for a long time. Their family lived in Australia. And as we talked about this, it turned out that they had been very often wearing this kind of like Christmassy style jumper, even though it wasn't Christmas. But that, and I was like, okay, that's interesting. Someone in your family wear anything like that? And they hadn't made the connection that it's their dad that often wears at random times of the year this kind of Christmas-like jumper, and they found themselves during the lockdown wearing it more frequently. And they made the connection that they were wearing it because it reminded them of their dad and kind of gave them that comfort and that link to home and the support that they have there, and that emotional comfort. And it's really nice, I think, when you see people who are able to make use of clothing to support their everyday well-being in that way. And I always tell the story of, and it's stuck with me for years, of this one woman I met, and she had bipolar, and she spoke about the fact when she feels herself kind of going into a period of low mood, sometimes doesn't stop it, but when she feels it, she goes and she puts on her favorite t-shirt, which has a big picture of David Bowie on the front. And she wears it because it makes her feel happy, because she loves David Bowie. So she literally wears that clothing as a way to kind of say, oh, I feel it coming on, no, and trying to kind of bring about those kind of positive feelings in herself. To, in the same way, if you're feeling low, you might have a bit of chocolate or something sugary to kind of pick yourself up and give yourself a little treat. It kind of boosts, doesn't it, that kind of the serotonin and the dopamine, and that's what she would do, but with clothing. And I just love that example. Just imagine her going for a little walk in her David Bowie t-shirt, and just to lift herself up a bit.
Very conscious, yeah. It's
very conscious, yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. I really love the idea of fashion almost being like a sugar fix. That's brilliant note to end on. So we do have a couple of questions from the audience before we break. So Rebecca has asked, do you find dress therapy is especially useful in treatment of particular conditions?
Dress therapy, well, I don't do that. I wouldn't dare do that. Dion, do you do?
I don't do that either. No, so sorry. I feel bad for that person asked the question. I've never used dress therapy. I will work with a person to explore their personal style and their confidence and self-esteem, where they are now compared to where they were before. But I wouldn't call it dress therapy, because it's very rarely that you end up even going shopping with that person or putting clothing on, because there's so much more work to do before that. And you realize that a lot of the issues they're coming to you with, that even though they say, I have nothing to wear, I don't feel comfortable in my style, there's much more to it than buying a new pair of jeans for them. So you end up doing all the kind of background subconscious work before that. And I think, so not so much dress therapy, no. But I'll be interested to hear some more about it. I might look it up later.
Absolutely. And Omar has said, do you come across apparent or clear psychosomatic connections between how people relate to their body and what manifests on their body?
I'm curious about what manifests on their body or in their body, like a sense.
On the body. It could be in their body, but I think, yeah, he's talking about on the body. So it's the connections between how people relate to their body and what manifests on their body, whether there are some apparent or clear psychosomatic connections.
I'm not really sure that I understand the question. I think what manifests in how they dress, or what manifests like, oh, I've got a,
I feel like a rash and things like that, maybe.
Yeah.
Really, it's about the difference between how we might feel about our body and then how it really does look. Do you think there are differences in how people sort of see themselves and their body image compared to how it really is? I'm thinking, Hilda, about the model that you worked with. So she may have had quite a distinction there between how she appears to other people and how she feels about herself, for example.
Yeah. I mean, that was definitely the case with her. But I guess what maybe this is not, I don't think this is the question, but definitely, you know, the body keeps the score. You know, I see a young man that I work with in prison who, you know, has this recurrent left shoulder pain, and you know, we kind of talk about when did it start, and it started when you know, around the time that a very serious PTSD incident occurred. So I think that trauma definitely is felt in the body. Now, how that relates to clothing, I haven't, I don't know, I haven't really seen that. But definitely how we feel is, you know, how we feel, a judgment on ourselves, our thoughts, our memories, our trauma, I think is definitely held on in the body. And of course that can restrict, that can have an impact, I'm sure, in terms of the clothing choices we make, because if we feel pain in a certain area, maybe we want to, I don't know, we want to wear something more flexible, we want to hide that area, we're self-conscious. There probably is a link, but I don't really know.
I think what comes to mind for me, and I don't know also if this answers the question, but I think when you talked to Hilda there about the young man with the pain in the shoulder, I was thinking of a person I worked with who, when we were exploring their dress, they would often wear, again, this oversized, lots of layers though. But in terms of the kind of psychosomatic, they often felt cold. So they would kind of say they're cold and they put a scarf on or another jacket on or another jump, but always wrapping up and kind of like wrapping the body. And after working with them, it did turn out that there had been a sexual assault. And it was following that they started to conceal the body, to wrap up. And I linked it maybe slightly to that feeling of being exposed and that kind of wanting to reconcile and conceal yourself and keep yourself safe. But that's the only example I can think of where that's kind of come about, actually.
Well, thank you both. And yes, something that comes to mind for me is thinking about Schilder and sort of his founding work on body image, you know, working with returning soldiers from the war, and maybe they'd lost a limb, but they could actually still feel that limb, even though it didn't exist for them anymore. So that sort of connection between mind and body, and that really sort of, it did start how we consider the idea of body image. That's where it stems from. So this idea that we have in our minds of ourselves. So yeah, thank you for your question, Omar. That was really, really interesting. And thank you all for your lovely comments. I think they were the only direct questions, but there are lots of great comments in the chat box as well. So thank you so much, Hilda and Dion. That was a really, really fascinating discussion. So thank you for being here. And now we're going to break for lunch for an hour. So we'll come back at 2:30 to resume. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this afternoon session of the conference. I hope everyone had a good break. My name's Leah Gouget-Levy, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you our next speakers for this afternoon session. So our next speakers are Caroline Alenowitz-Hess. Caroline is a fashion historian based in New York City. She's currently a PhD student at the Bard Graduate Center and hosts webinars on fashion history with the New York Adventure Club. Caroline spent several years working as a fashion designer before pursuing her MA in fashion studies from Parsons. And she previously received a BA in English literature from Yale University and an AAS in fashion design from the FIT. Her writings being published in Fashion Theory, Journal of Design History, Atlas Obscura, Jezebel, and the Bloomsbury Fashion Video Archive. And she's also curated an online exhibition for the Underpinnings Museum and has been quoted in articles in Harper's Bazaar, ID, and W Magazine. Her research is focused on definitions of femininity in the 20th century in France and the United States. And her title for today's talk is Reckoning with Highland Rape, Sexuality, Violence, and Power on the Runway. Over to you, Caroline.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen so that I can start my presentation. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Caroline Alenowitz-Hess, and this is Reckoning with Highland Rape, Sexuality, Violence, and Power on the Runway. A photograph of a 5-inch sutured surgical scar was the only image that appeared on the invitation to Alexander McQueen's fall 1995 fashion show. It was mysterious. Would horror or healing lie ahead? Highland Rape, McQueen's 4th runway collection, was a turning point in his career. The title of the show, along with the portrayal of female models on the runway in ripped, revealing clothing, was undeniably provocative. While some reviewers labeled it misogynistic, others praised it. It remains one of McQueen's most challenging and debated presentations, and the duality suggested in the macabre invitation remains unsolved. The controversy surrounding Highland Rape raised McQueen's profile considerably, and only a year later, he was appointed creative director of French haute couture house Givenchy. Yet, for all the debate surrounding Highland Rape, there's been little analysis of the specific elements of the show itself, either in contemporary reviews or later scholarship. When addressing McQueen's use of sexual violence, critics have focused generally on this show as either representative of McQueen's artistry, suggesting that either McQueen's work is too complex and authentic to be criticized, or in McQueen as merely an example of misogyny in fashion, and thereby reading all portrayals of women as victims as misogynistic. McQueen himself consistently objected to accusations of misogyny, instead saying that the phrase Highland Rape referred to England's historical assaults upon his ancestral homeland of Scotland, i.e. the violence enacted by English forces in the Scottish Highlands in the 18th century, or his own experience with violence and assault. In particular, he alluded to witnessing the abuse that his sister suffered at the hands of her ex-husband. This explanation, however, fails to take into account the visual language of the garments themselves and how the performance fits into representations of sexual violence more broadly. A nuanced critique of Highland Rape and McQueen has to consider how fashion plays a crucial role in identity formation, as well as how clothing articulates ideas of bodies, sex, violence, and power. Examining Highland Rape through a closer reading of the garments themselves, alongside McQueen's authorial intent, reveals a performance that ultimately glamorizes sexual violence and exploits the subjugation and exposure of women's bodies. This is especially relevant when considering the way in which the models enacting his vision fit into the fashion hierarchy as figures with minimal bodily autonomy. Many of you are probably familiar with the reputation of the runway show, but I did want to show you the first 2 minutes of it to give you a frame of reference. I'm also going to skip ahead to the end. As you can see, Highland Rape was set up as a conventional runway show in a tent at British Fashion Week. The soundtrack consisted of clanging bells, thunder, house music, and the occasional siren, while the stage was covered with scattered heather and bracken. As you can see, models were styled with long red hair or short pixie cuts, and some wore white contact lenses, making their eyes appear glassy and staring. Although there were complete garments shown, many pieces included sheer lace, rips, or tears. Commentary about the show has focused chiefly on staggering and blood-spattered models, but there was no consistent way of walking throughout, and only a few models wore gloves that appeared blood-spattered. Many of the models walked in a more typical runway manner, even occasionally including a flirtatious smile. During her walk down the runway, one model slipped her hand into the tear in her skirt as if to touch her genitalia, while suggestively biting her lip, as you can see in the image here. Another model staggered unsteadily down the runway, wearing a dress with a slash across the chest, revealing one nipple. Some included a pseudo-military march. Model Jodie Kidd, who was 15 years old at the time, appeared in striped briefs and a jacket with no shirt. She clutched the jacket throughout to cover her breasts, but they were still exposed several times. One model walked down the runway acting awkward and frightened, constantly pulling and adjusting her skirt, and another lurched down the runway in a black dress, ripped open to reveal her right breast, which she periodically tried to cover with her hand. This model appeared as the final look of the show, cowering against the back wall. Fashion critics responded immediately with a mixture of interest and disgust. For example, fashion critic Sally Brampton from The Guardian questioned McQueen's talent, calling the show a sour note and concluding that it is McQueen's brand of misogynistic absurdity that gives fashion a bad name. Marion Hume and Tamsin Blanchard at The Independent took a similar view. The Emperor's New Clothes, rape victims staggering in dresses clawed to the breast were a sick joke, as were knitted dresses that M&S would make better for a fraction of the price. McQueen likes to shock. To admit to not liking his clothing is to admit to being prudish. So he admitted. He is a skillful tailor and a great showman, but why should models play abused victims? The show was an insult to women and to his talent. American reviewers were considerably more positive. Women's Wear Daily praised the show as boundary pushing, writing the Highland Rape was aggressive and disturbing. Some even say the political rhetoric was a bit passé, but everybody left talking about it, which is more than you can say for many shows this season. However, the article went on to wonder what pillage has to do with selling clothes. Journalist Amy Spindler at the New York Times called it an obvious ploy at provocation, but went on to praise the show, announcing that it was a collection packed with restless, rousing ideas, by far the best of the London season. There was also coverage of the show on television and radio, underscoring its provocative character and the designer's enfant terrible reputation. Irrespective of the criticism of Highland Rape, there was no disputing the fact that this show made Alexander McQueen's name, and in the following year, he was appointed chief designer at the famed French couture house Givenchy. Analysis and commentary by fashion scholars over the 25 years since Highland Rape has focused primarily on how the show's controversy raised McQueen's profile, and the way in which its themes fit into the designer's work as a whole. Fashion historian Caroline Evans' book, Fashion at the Edge, Spectacle, Maternity, and Deathliness, explores McQueen's work in detail and offers the most in-depth analysis of Highland Rape show itself. She asserts that representations of cruelty to women are not necessarily an indication of misogyny, writing, "The cruelty inherent in McQueen's representations of women was part of the designer's wider vision of the cruelty of the world, and although his view was undoubtedly bleak, it was not misogynist. Evans' analysis sidesteps the difficult question of the ethics of McQueen's show, framing the theme and styling of his show as a value-neutral aesthetic choice. She also raises the issue of theatricality in her response to McQueen's critics. Criticisms of McQueen's work as misogynistic have tended to obscure its defining characteristics, she says. The theatrical staging of cruelty. Although most apparent in the styling of his collections, his aesthetic of cruelty also extended to his designs where it is not only thematic, but intrinsic to his cutting techniques and his method of construction. Evans stresses McQueen's supposed consistency in depicting cruelty. However, it's not clear how thematic cruelty fundamentally negates misogyny. In fact, Evans' method of analysis and her focus on the thematic coherence of styling, cutting techniques, and construction appears to make it impossible to find a way in which a design could be deemed misogynistic or exploitative, short of the designer himself saying that his hatred of women was a prime motivator. Overall, much commentary on McQueen's misogyny has been ambivalent. Washington Post fashion critic Robin Givhan responded to the issue of McQueen's misogyny as an open question, saying, "Much of what he did made you scratch your head and ask, is he for or against women? You weren't quite sure if he was empowering them or if he was subjugating them." By contrast, journalists such as The Guardian's Joan Smith have specifically identified McQueen as misogynistic, inquiring why McQueen associated women's bodies with rape, murder, and trash. Her critical editorial about Alexander McQueen asked, "When you're basically there to write about clothes, what are you to make of models tottering along the catwalk in ripped dresses looking like blood-stained rape victims?" Smith's dismissive comment that you're basically there to write about clothes suggests that it's fashion itself, not just McQueen, that is ill-equipped to wrestle with complex issues and blood-stained rape victims. Similarly, feminist scholar Sheila Jeffries used McQueen as a symbol of innate misogyny in fashion. McQueen counters Evans' assertion that McQueen's women were portrayed as powerful, saying the idea that women gain power over men by being clothed as prostitutes or dominatrixes is a pernicious myth. Andrew Bolton, the curator of the 2011 McQueen Savage Beauty exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, dismissed this type of critique, saying the liberal press in particular was quick to label McQueen as the latest in a long line of male homosexual designers who exploit women while pandering to their own fantasies. He countered that the show was a comment on the designer's heritage, personal history, and his own fantasies. For these scholars and commentators, the debate fundamentally concerns whether the themes of rape and cruelty are areas that fashion could or should explore. In the case of Highland Rape, however, the show offers a more complete picture of what McQueen is communicating about sexual violence through the specificity of its clothing, styling, and model bodies. Examining McQueen's own language about Highland Rape reveals an inconsistency about the intention of the show, and McQueen to be an unreliable source of analysis for his own work. McQueen complained, "People were so unintelligent, they thought this was about women being raped. Yet Highland Rape was about England's rape of Scotland." Although this explanation tries to separate the rape of women from the metaphorical rape of Scotland, the show itself featured women who had appeared as though they had been physically assaulted, and the display of breasts and genitalia reinforced the sexual nature of that violence. Furthermore, rape has been a weapon of war throughout history, which muddies the distinction between women being raped and England's rape of Scotland. Using victimized women to prove a point, moreover, positions women's bodies as objects rather than subjects, replicating rather than challenging the historical role of women as pawns or prizes. Some of McQueen's other explanations took a different angle. "I'm not a misogynist, but the idea was saying to the public a man takes from a woman. The woman's not giving it, and that's what rape is. My older sister was badly beaten up by her husband, and when you're 8 years old and you're seeing your sister strangled by her husband, you know, all you want to do is make women look stronger." Although McQueen's exposure to violence clearly influenced his aesthetic, the idea that his Highland Rape collection makes women look stronger is puzzling. Even if McQueen wanted to position his characters as survivors rather than victims, the emphasis on the aesthetic of the immediate aftermath of assault, including tears and stains, focuses on what has happened to them rather than any other part of the story. Despite his earlier assertion that this show was only about Scotland, here McQueen refers to the act of rape in its personal context, as he appears to be suggesting that this show serves the purpose of raising awareness of the horrors of rape. The runway show, with its dance music and deliberately sexualized posing, however, links rape and violence with glamour and performance, highlighting the display of women's bodies over any discernible political message. It's difficult to reconcile Highland rape with McQueen's stated belief throughout his career to create a woman who looks so fabulous you wouldn't dare lay a hand on her. This imagined woman seems paradoxical when Highland rape so explicitly portrays women upon whom hands have been laid. Despite McQueen's rhetorical embrace of a strong woman ideal, the idea that fashion can protect women from sexual assault seems more in line with misogynistic rhetoric that certain types of clothes invite sexual assault than a rebalance of power in a patriarchal society. Clothing often plays a critical role in the interpretation of consent in rape cases, wherein garments perceived as revealing or provocative are understood to be a proxy for consent. This is in spite of the fact that statistically, the type of clothing worn by the victim has no correlation to the likelihood of assault. McQueen further undermined the idea of a coherent authorial intent in his inconsistent and at times vitriolic response to criticism of the show. In 1996, he told the Sunday Times, "The critics should have been grateful to me. At least I was giving them something to write about. They completely misunderstood Highland rape. It wasn't anti-women. It was actually anti the fake history of Vivienne Westwood. She makes tartan lovely and romantic and tries to pretend that's how it was. Well, 18th century Scotland was not about beautiful women drifting across the moors in swaths of unmanageable chiffon. My show was anti that sort of romanticism." His framing of the show emphasizes a realist rather than romantic perspective. The reference to Vivienne Westwood and Highland rape as a counterpoint to drifting across the moors suggests that the show could even be read as aggressive towards Westwood's idealized woman or Westwood herself. McQueen also asserted that the criticism was a matter of intellect, saying, "You only needed a little intelligence to take the clothes out of context and look and see how they were cut. I can't compensate for a lack of intelligence, but I wish people would try a bit harder. The show is meant to provoke an emotional response. It's my 30 minutes to do whatever I want." The idea that those who criticized his show were responding too emotionally rather than intellectually is at odds with the deliberately visceral nature of the show itself and contradicts the touches that McQueen included to emphasize a brutal contrast to the romantic vision of Scotland. In opposition to his previous insistence on his own sensitivity to the issue of rape, he added, "It was really just a hedonistic collection, wild women in the Highlands." A characteristic that associates the model's faltering walks down the runway with pleasure-fueled abandon. These justifications both minimize the seriousness with which commentators address the show, quote, "just a hedonistic collection," and simultaneously accuse them of failing to engage with its historical elements. McQueen did not entertain the validity of any criticism, a defensiveness that was also demonstrated in the fact that he reportedly punished reviewers for their negative reviews of Highland rape by moving at least one fashion critic to the third row and failing to invite others to his subsequent presentations. The lack of coherence in the way McQueen's statements addressed criticism necessitates heightened attention to the medium through which he supposedly communicated best, his design. Examination of the show itself can therefore expose the message that both the clothes and the performance tell about women and sexual violence. The combination of staggering, cowering models and those that were deliberately presenting as sexually available, e.g. by rubbing their bodies or biting their lips while looking out into the audience, displayed an illusion of sexual violence and sexual pleasure. The slashes on the clothes highlighted the women's erogenous zones, with several pieces that deliberately exposed the nipples or crotch, a choice that not only emphasized the sexual interests of the aggressor, but placed the audience in the role of erotic voyeurs. Bleach stains on the crotch of certain looks implied that the model was so frightened they had peed their pants, adding a particularly visceral layer to the show as the clothes themselves appeared embedded with fear. That's what you can see here on the right. Another important element of the collection was the chains, hanging from the model's skirts, which some reviewers had called tampon strings. Andrew Bolton clarified, saying they were in fact watch fobs and were actually more subversive than tampons. The chain was threaded between the legs from the bottom to the crotch. Isabella Blow, the famous stylist who was a close friend and mentor of McQueen, described at length the personal satisfaction the chain provided her as she walked. In a different context, the erotic implication of the silver watch fob could be playful. In the context of rape, it is distinctly sinister, representing an aggressor literally in contact with the model's genitalia without her consent. Here, what Bolton calls subversive might be better characterized as invasive. Additionally, the use of models' bodies as a medium to create this show raises further issues of gender, power, and vulnerability, which is particularly relevant when considering themes of sexual violence. In examining McQueen's show, the models function as crucial intermediaries whose role affects the meaning of the work itself. In this case, the instability and replaceability of the average model puts them at a distinct power disadvantage in the fashion industry vis-a-vis the designer, which complicates the idea of seeing them as co-creators of this runway show. Sociologist Ashley Mears has called the model's relationship to her agency indentured servitude, as they are obligated to pay off the debts the agency incurs to establish them as a model, making it especially difficult for a model to turn down work or to otherwise disrupt the relationship to the client or designer. In contrast to the images of models as the embodiment of glamour, the careers of models are frequently characterized by lack of control over their professional careers, alienation from their own selves, bodies and emotions, personal insecurity, commodification, and so on. McQueen's own attitude towards models reinforced a power dynamic wherein models were passive actors, which in turn diminished the possibility of the model's agency in the creation and performance of Highland Rape. McQueen was renowned for his authority over his models because he demanded energy from his army of models. For the duration of the show, they were under his aesthetic control, and once on the catwalk, he often demanded of them a performativity asked by no other designer. Journalist Judith Thurman's posthumous New Yorker profile pointed out that McQueen certainly subjected his models to extreme trials. They were caged in glass boxes or padded cells, half smothered or drowned, masked, tethered, tightly laced, straitjacketed, and forced to walk in perilous armadillo booties with 10-inch heels. Jodie Kidd, a model from the Highland Rape show, discussed her experience with McQueen in the 2018 documentary, saying, "I honestly just thought that he didn't like women. He didn't like models. He didn't like anything. He was just trying to torture us all. But his vision, when you actually came down, and the silhouette and the way he made you look was so extraordinary. I don't think I really understood, because I was 15 at the time, exactly what was going on or the connotations of it." Although Kidd reflects on the show as extraordinary, her original perceptions of the show showed that at least some of the models found the clothing hostile and were uninformed about its meaning, even as they were participating in it. The New Yorker profile went on to quote McQueen's response to the question of what his models might have thought about the constraints that he subjected them to. He said, "We're not talking about models' feelings here. We're talking about mine." This power dynamic between McQueen and the models is significant because consent and bodily autonomy are at the heart of sexual violence. Art historian Angelique Shimanek argues that for a work about sexual violence to be subversive, it must trouble or upend gendered power dynamics. Using model bodies as objects through which to convey ideas without specifically considering their bodily autonomy in an industry in which models who say no to clients do not work foregrounds the issue of consent on the runway and raises the question of whether the semi-nudity and implied violence on the runway replicated a troubling backstage power dynamic. Kidd, when talking publicly about the show, made clear she was uninformed about it, and as she was only 15 years old, it's difficult to see her as a totally empowered participant. The consequences of models' lack of power in these professional situations were highlighted in a 2018 Boston Globe report that revealed the extent of the sexual abuse and harassment that models face in professional settings. The authors wrote, nearly 60% of models interviewed by the Globe said that they'd been touched inappropriately during work-related situations. The violations range from unwanted kissing to rape. Yet, for decades, victims of sexual misconduct in the fashion fashion world have struggled to be heard and taken seriously. Drawing attention to the metaphorical rape of Scotland with model bodies, but failing to note the conditions of the models themselves, wearing clothing such as jackets that continually opened when they walked and having silver chains threaded between their legs that deliberately tested their boundaries, suggests the garments themselves are complicit in an industry that fails to respect the bodies that McQueen chose to display. Some scholars have compared McQueen's runway shows with performance art as a way to emphasize their complexity, but even viewing them through that lens, Highland Rape fails to interrogate the issues of women's bodily autonomy in a subversive way. Explaining how feminist performance artists have dealt with issues of bodily autonomy and rape, performance studies scholar Julia Steinmetz has argued that female artists' construction and presentation of their bodies as already sexualized resides in the simultaneous presence of the artist as subject and object. Even as we are viewing the artist's body as a sexual object, we're conscious of her status as the author of her own image, her control and authority over her own body, and her embodied subjectivity. For example, in Yoko Ono's influential performance art piece, Cut Piece, first performed in Japan in 1964, she offered scissors and invited members of the audience to cut off pieces of her clothing, blurring the relationship between giving and taking, and using her own body as a medium to explore violence and consent. In the use of models, the tension of objectivity-subjectivity is not present. Both the models and the part they play as rape victims are objectified, in contrast to McQueen's role as designer and male subject. In this case, McQueen's runway performance combines all the elements of spectacle, erotic fantasy, and punishment, which enforce rather than disrupt the typical characterization of rape within a patriarchal culture. McQueen himself appeared to be part of this mechanism, wherein even though he himself had been a victim of sexual assault, he used other vulnerable bodies to enact those traumas and build his own reputation as a provocateur. Considering the meaning and impact of Highland Rape remains relevant when reckoning with the legacy of a designer called a genius upon his death in 2010. Subsequent staging of museum exhibitions of McQueen's work, Savage Beauty first at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and then at the Victoria Albert in London, have cemented him as an icon of his time. The 2018 documentary McQueen has also reinforced his position as a troubled genius, reading his personal biography into his work. In all three examples, Highland Rape features as a notable part of a misunderstood iconoclastic persona. However, critiquing and examining the way McQueen dealt with issues of power and agency allows for an understanding of the potential or limitations of the runway for engagement with serious issues of gender, sexuality, power, and violence. McQueen's imagination, experimentation, and willingness to push boundaries have cemented his place in the history of fashion. But this outsized reputation should not overcome or obscure criticism of the specificities of his work. With the rise of the Me Too movement, the issue of consent on the runway has become even more critical, not only because of the reckoning regarding exploitation within modeling and the fashion industry itself, but also because references to power and consent have continued to appear in runway presentations. Missoni's Fall/Winter 2017 collection prominently featured pussy hats, echoing the ones worn at the 2017 women's marches against the election of Donald Trump. In particular, they referenced his comment on the leaked Access Hollywood tape to grab them, meaning women, by the pussy. For Dior's Fall/Winter,
Caroline, if you could just wrap up in a couple of minutes, that would be great.
This is like my last sentence.
Sorry.
Missoni, for Dior's Fall/Winter 2020 collection, creative director Maria Grazia Curie collaborated with anonymous feminist art collective Claire Fontaine, who illuminated the runway with lighted signs, including one declaring "consent, consent, consent." Although these attempts were not necessarily successful, they testify to fashion's continued desire to address issues of sexual violence. Directly engaging with the challenging, contradictory, and sometimes disturbing aspects of McQueen's work allows for a more complex and critical legacy, while also contributing to the wider question of how fashion negotiates with sex, violence, and power. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's get right into it. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the plenary session. My name is Nadia, and with me are Rebecca, Lucy, Connie, and Leah from the Documenting Fashion Group. we'd like to discuss the themes that have emerged in the conference. And I think the title bears repeating now: Unraveling Threads, Tracing and Transforming Violence and Trauma Through Fashion. We will be glad to hear from everyone in the audience about what has stood out, links between papers if you've observed any, and to identify areas for future exploration. Please feel free to give comments and post questions in the chat box. Lucy, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Nadia. I wasn't actually planning to be in this session, but I'm happy to join you guys.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to be. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
But,
I'm happy to join in if you'd like. Feel free to ask me any questions.
Okay, then I'll just open the floor. Everyone can, give comments and pose questions. I think personally, when I saw the title, I thought that, of course, with the word violence in it, that it would have that come through more in all the sessions. But I've been struck by how I think, it's been very personal, but also there's sort of like a gentle approach to thinking about violence, to transforming into something else, as we just saw in the last session. I wonder, Leah, if you wanted to pick up some threads that you might have observed in the past 2 sessions you chat.
Let me unmute myself first. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, that kind of talk about different levels of violence and different kinds of violence, not only kind of physical, but kind of emotional, and all sorts of different levels and ways in which violence is inflicted. But I thought Eric's and Mani's talks were really, it was a brilliant thing to end on, to think about the way in which fashion is not only violent but can also heal, and the different ways in which that can happen. And I think it's all about that fascinating contradiction. Fashion is always discussed in contradictory terms, and I think this is one of the, on one hand there is violence, and on the other hand there is this kind of healing power as well. And I think it's quite nice to be reminded of that at the end.
And what about for you, Liz? I think you're still muted.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking that kind of over the last couple of days, what was kind of emerging for me was that sort of violence and trauma is understood, is, I suppose, conceptualized, it's treated differently by individuals. And I thought that was kind of good. And I thought the richness and the variety of all the different papers was really good in giving us a sense that, there is no such thing as a universal experience of violence or trauma. But one thing that I have been thinking about a lot in my research recently is the way in which I do think the whole kind of foundation of psychoanalysis is predicated on, I think it's called WEIRD. What does it stand for? Like Western, educated, industrialized, rich democratic societies, the whole kind of discipline of it. And I suppose the question I have, which I'd kind of like to know what other people think. Maybe I'm posing it as a sort of provocation, but like the way in which we've been understanding violence and trauma, is it like specifically Western, the way we have been dealing with it? And maybe if we're kind of moving ideas for how we could expand the conference or ideas in the future, would it be to think about how violence and trauma is experienced in more culturally specific ways through fashion? I don't know if that kind of emerged.
No, I think that's such a brilliant observation. And I was thinking just that during Otto's presentation, actually, the fact that he said, like, who dictates what happens in the fashion community? I've been thinking about that because, as you go through, for example, Instagram, and then it depends on who you follow, right? And you kind of get swayed into doing things a certain way or wearing something because you think it looks good. And, how is that kind of about not only our circumstances dictating what's happening, but also the choices that you make, kind of these micro choices you make then shaping the way they experience it. And in the last session, you know, we heard very personal stories about, you know, unsung heroes, and also like a very interesting, but kind of, I guess, by the fact that it's not well known, or it's not, you know, a common practice, a way of resolving violence, that's also such an eye-opener. And I'm excited to see what else we don't know about, you know, all these micro histories that are waiting to be discovered. So I totally hear your point.
Yeah, because I feel like the kind of colonial logic is so ingrained within us that even the kind of the study of psychoanalysis, we often place it on different societies as a kind of universal, when really it's based on quite specific context. Yeah, but
yeah, I think we often have, I think, yeah, certainly in these kind of contexts that we're talking in the West, we have a certain language of violence that we tend to go to, and that is informed by kind of theories like psychoanalysis stuff. And I think, yeah, that language itself kind of really, our way of expression is so ingrained in certain kinds of thought that it is easy to slip into that. And trauma is such a personal thing, as we've seen in the last session. I think it's such a personal thing, and I think that's often overlooked, especially in like academic context, academic research. There's a tendency to be afraid of going into the kind of the personal and the subjective response, and maybe that is something that we need to push against and look at more.
Yeah, but it's tricky, isn't it? Because then on the other hand, how do we ensure it's not like a fetishization of trauma? Like, because I chat to my students a lot about, you know, position at Central St. Martin's, about positionality and you know, all of the kind of issues we're talking about. And we talk a lot kind of thinking about Sarah Ahmed and how emotions are kind of historically, politically located, and, you know, how do you kind of allow that in without making sure it's not fetishized? But I'm not really wrapping up the themes of the conference.
No, but I mean, I think that's a great observation. And I think also, you know, earlier you mentioned, Leah, that it's just something so personal. How do you get the students to do it in a way that's comfortable? How do we know that we're not kind of pushing it too far? And I think many mentioned how, like, you know, sometimes you get comments that, you know, maybe he's not trained professionally in doing this kind of therapy. So then, you know, it becomes something like a minefield, because you want to kind of explore it, but then you feel almost like a self-censorship on many levels, from the position of the lecturer, but also from the position of students. Because is it a safe space, right, within the classroom to do this? And how much can you expose without feeling like you've done too much? And then how does the lecturer or the tutor also manage this setting so that, you know, it stays within the classroom, it doesn't have repercussions that take the trauma further potentially. So yeah, just taking your thread, Liz, and going with it a little bit, but yeah, definitely no wrapping up in this instance. I think maybe we can go into the audience's comments and questions, and then maybe that will put us back on the path. So Eric, you noted that, I think Eric was responding to a question from Lucy, but I think it's good to say it here as well. He says that he thinks the major interest for him is in thinking about affirmation people can take from the taken for granted epistemologies and technologies of craft practices in which people have been able to be resilient. This is one thing he's been thinking about, but also how fashion lets us reclaim resilience as something to not be discarded, as something that overlooks struggle, but can hold each of those things simultaneously. I think this is a great observation about how fashion can kind of be a way to, I guess, take back what has been taken away.
Yeah, because I think, yeah, it feels like it. I think that's a really great point, because it kind of touches upon the way that, yeah, fashion can both be used within a system of power to kind of essentialize and to categorize bodies. But if something can be, power can operate in both ways. So it can also be empowering. And I think it's grappling with that, which is where clothing, dress, fashion, style, whichever definitions we're using, it becomes really interesting.
I think that's also where it's kind of interesting with the example of McQueen and the Highland Rape collection, because in one way it could be seen as that, but then it gets into such a bind almost at the same time. I think it's everything that Elizabeth said, and yet we see it playing out in that collection in such a difficult way that has such polarizing, has produced such polarizing responses.
Yeah. And I think it's, one of the threads then that we can say emerge from all these sessions is, I guess, people reclaiming, what's theirs, or kind of using fashion as a way to take back the power. I think that's such a positive way of looking at how fashion can resolve trauma, can transform violence into something positive. And then there's this community that kind of embraces this way of thinking, this way of doing. I certainly think that with Omer and Maya's session earlier, when they revisited their home in Sudan, I thought that was really beautiful, the way that they said, the trip triggered memories that they had kept hidden, that they didn't even know was suppressed. And then they found a way to honor those memories and to put out something positive and beautiful, and then kind of spreading the word beyond the community, because, we, for example, got to benefit from these beautiful images and to hear about the processes of making them. So I'm going to go to the next comments from Hadia Anvari. Is there such a thing as fast fashion? Isn't all fashion fast? And to link it to violence, this makes them think that violence or pressure towards people who work in fashion across the creation and production chain and planet Earth, I guess. So I think that's an interesting way to think about it as well, to think about how fast-paced fashion has become. And again, Otto mentioned earlier that the pandemic hasn't really made any significant changes, he thinks, to the way that fashion is practiced and experienced. And so I wonder what you think, Liz and Leah. Do you think that fast fashion is in itself a violent act, a violent phenomenon?
Yeah, definitely. And ultra fast fashion too. And I had a really interesting conversation with somebody the other day who kind of had said she was actually a fashion curator. She said she was leaving the industry because she was questioning what is this like collective trauma that encourages people to shop in this way, like to just consume, it in this way. And I thought that was really interesting because it was a good question, like why this need for like newness, for excitement all the time? Because I understand how fashion is this process of kind of personal storytelling, and we put things together, and it does feel it's an escapism from the everydayness of life. But to kind of consume on this level, it's like, how did we get to this stage? Yeah, and she described it as a kind of collective trauma that we're grappling with, which I thought was interesting. But she was leaving the industry to become a psychotherapist. So
Right. Yeah, I think, I was just reading about, I'm not sure if you guys know about this brand called Shein. So I, on my Facebook feed, for some reason, I had like Shein ads, but then also all these groups I follow that, consume secondhand fashion or do swapping and things like that. And so I thought it was kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. Like there's so much being produced, but then there are people who are really trying very hard to slow down. And then somehow they coexist. And like, how does that work? And then how does it all kind of have space to, thrive, these opposite practices? And I think it's also made me want to be more conscious of how I consume, because I think we've all had that kind of experience of like scrolling through, an online shopping site, and at some point you feel a bit ill because you've done too much of it, and then you kind of feel like you've your eyes are tired, and then you're kind of like what am I doing? It's late at night. And as you said, Liz, it's a kind of escapism, but then it doesn't really feel positive. It doesn't really feel happy because it's just for that short while. And then, you know, the consequences of that act kind of like, yeah, make you feel guilty, make you feel traumatized even. What do you think? I'm not sure if I'm alone in this because I'm not seeing any nods of like, yes, I've done
Yeah,
this
no,
too.
definitely. I mean, it's funny because Jonathan Crary in his book 24/7, like I can't remember what it's called, Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep or something. He talks about this, you know, this kind of need to sort of round the clock consumption and how it's kind of altered the fact that you can consume at any time of the day has like fundamentally altered our psyche. But what's interesting is he's writing in 2013, you know, and yet I was reading that during the pandemic thinking feels so, it felt really portentous of what was to come.
Yeah, I think that it's that kind of, that notion of it's a temporal trauma, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the time itself as a violent thing, as a thing that is kind of feeling out of control and imposed upon us.
Definitely.
And yeah, exactly. So I really agree, and I think it's one of the key things that fashion industry at the moment is having to grapple with and is grappling with, and as far, you know, from what as far as I can say, is not found the answers to yet, of how to deal with this temporal trauma and bring a different, what are the if we're thinking about healing and healing from trauma, what's a kind of temporal healing that we could do? And maybe that is something a bit like what Eric was talking about in terms of kind of ancestors and their presence and the past in that way. I'm not sure, it's just ideas that have kind of been provoked today, but yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, I really did you talk about that in your PhD, Leah?
a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting because it kind of reminds us it's all a construct, isn't it? Like the world hasn't really sped up. We, you know, I think you know what I mean.
Well, it's exactly this idea that time is not a priori, it's not something that's outside of us. Time is inherently experiential, or at least that's the perspective I deal with it from in my own work. And so it's kind of, how do you grapple with that and turn that into something that's actually positive and isn't harming us in the way that it appears to be now? And is it to recognize that time is not an external thing, it is an experience, and there are, you know, is that freeing in itself to think of, okay, if it is an experience and it's not outside of us, how can we produce a better relationship with it?
Yeah. I think that brings to mind, you know, another term, right? I mean, there's fast fashion, but there's also slow fashion. But then, of course, there are different types of slow fashion, and not all slow fashion is created equal. And, you know, sometimes that can also be a misnomer or just a marketing tactic. So that in itself, to me, feels quite violent at times, because then you kind of have to wade through that category or that label to really understand what's going on. So there's also some level of deception, I think, that can go on with like terms that are overused, like slow fashion or sustainability. I know that there's much more going on beneath the surface than what we are served. And I think Lucy wanted to jump on the point that you were making, and thinking about temporality as violent is fascinating. And she noted that, you know, the very nature of fashion is seasonal, cyclical. And that's true. I think, you know, we always think about it. I feel sometimes I think of it as the onslaught of like fashion, and it's just relentless the way they're going at it. And then, you know, sometimes it's a source of pride as well. Like, you know, a designer is creating for how many collections a year, and like how many ready to wear and couture and whatever not. It's almost like a badge of honor. But I do think that with the pandemic, there's been this sense that time has slowed down. I mean, our experience of it, as you mentioned, Leah, that it's slowed down, but to a way that feels almost uncomfortable. I wonder how you have experienced fashion in this time, Leah and Lucy. Or not Lucy, I guess, Liz, and also Lucy too, since you brought it up.
Yeah, Lucy, what do you think?
Hi everyone. Camera on. I can just jump in, shall I? In 1 second. Okay. Hi, we're joining you guys now. So yeah, I mean, I think I really like this idea, Leah. I know I've done a lot of work about fashion and time. I think it's really, really interesting. It does, I think thinking about time as being violent is really, I haven't thought about it like that before, but it is true. It's the sort of construct that we have sort of imposed on ourselves for millennia, is sort of following this sort of almost quite a superficial construct, but you know, of day to night, it's quite segmented. It can be quite abrupt almost. And I think it does really relate to fashion's core. And again, we don't just have time, but we also apply that to fashion, the fashion calendar, the seasons, and the structure of that. So I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think again, it's the kind of the language of fashion as well. It's you often call, I think in fashion magazines and in the press, and you know, even in scholarship, there's talk about, and Caroline Evans talks about this obviously really fascinatingly in her book, but there's a lot of use of kind of the word death and as well in the terms of fashion and the changing fashion styles, the death of one style, the birth of a new style. And I think that in itself is very much about a violence of a violent end of one thing.
And the word deadline, I'm just thinking about it, like, you know, time and deadlines, and death is in that word. So yeah, it's almost as if you need to, like, you know, if you're preparing for an event, you're preparing to launch a collection, you're preparing to put things out online, there's a deadline for everything. And then you kind of like work to the bone to get there. And then after that, you're just sort of like, okay, now what? You know, sometimes that's the sense that, you know, there's like an echo back.
Yeah, and the violence that enacts on designers as well. I think we've all, you know, we all know the example of Raf Simons at Dior left because of this pace that was required of him. And then again, I think that's another example of a kind of temporal violence, but this on the producer, on the designer.
Yeah, and speaking of designers and violence, there's a comment from Omero who says, "It is interesting and troubling that McQueen is still associated with violence until this day. And he finds it unfortunate that a designer cannot be let to move on from a perspective once it's held." What do you think about that?
I think that's a really good point, because you realize this even in research, like when you publish something, then your ideas change. And I look back at things and I think like, oh, it's so static and fixed now, you know, but like obviously your ideas have moved in different ways, you know. So yeah, that resonates. Yeah. That you know, because it was a very specific period when McQueen was producing those collections, which are quite different to the period, you know, we're in now.
Yeah, and yeah, I think Caroline talked really interestingly about the kind of ambivalence of McQueen himself. He couldn't quite decide what it was he was saying, or he was saying so many different things with the collection. And yeah, it's kind of that question as well of, as historians, as scholars, how do you deal with the ambivalence of the designer, and if their account itself is contradictory, how do you battle with that question of kind of nailing down to one thing that often is kind of,
yeah,
we want to do, even though of course it's inherently plural, because it's always,
of course, yeah, and oftentimes they're not judged within the context they were made, but they're judged like contemporarily. I find that kind of annoying on social media sometimes, because, you know, people dig up what happened before and then they judge the work or the concept contemporarily, and it's just not fair. But then, you know, that's what clickbaits are about, and that's what, you know, happens sometimes. So yeah, I definitely feel that that's also a violent act. to not let the work kind of reflect the times and the mood that they were made in. I wonder, I mean, Lucy, now that we've kind of forced your hand to be part of this session, how you thought the conference played out based on your initial ideas about it. I think that would be really interesting to hear.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. I'm so thrilled with how it turned out. I mean, I want to thank everybody who's attended and everybody who's here, because I think, you know, it sort of exceeded my expectations in terms of what we've covered and sort of the different approaches to violence. I think you guys did touch on this at the start of your session, but this idea that we all have different definitions of violence and to some extent trauma as well, actually. And I think it's really interesting thinking about, is it physical violence? Is it psychological or mental violence, or even violence, you know, that's to do with something even more wide like time, like we've just been talking about. So I think it does work on all of these different aspects and levels. And so hearing the different approaches has been absolutely fascinating and given me so many new ideas. And also just the fact that so many of our speakers have been so sort of brave in sharing their personal stories, both today and yesterday. And I think that's really, really impressive. It's such a difficult thing to do, to make yourself vulnerable in a situation like this and to talk about sort of personal difficulties and traumas that you faced, and really, really beautiful to think about fashion as healing that. So I'm referring mostly to Mania's talk today here. I thought that was really, really moving. This idea that fashion doesn't have to be just something that's dismissed and superficial or just frivolous, but actually it has this real power in our lives. And Eric also spoke about this as well. And I think that's really, really beautiful and a really fantastic sort of note to end the conference on. And really just sort of championing fashion.
Yeah, I think the multiple aspects of fashion came through very beautifully in this conference. And it kind of, I think, widens the perspectives that we have of how we experience it. And then now I'm thinking, like, in what other ways is fashion violent as well? Because, you know, now we're even thinking that time could be a source of violence. But all in all, I think, you know, it's all been very positive, and there have been such amazing ideas that have come out. I wonder if, you know, aside from temporality being a source of violence potentially, what other areas of exploration have you identified for yourself based on what you've listened to in this conference?
Yeah, sure, that's directed at me. Well, so in the book that I've just published, I sort of tried to define violence and fashion on sort of different aspects and different levels. So I sort of drew some themes together. So one thing that I talked about and that has come up a lot in these 2 days is fragmentation. It came up quite a bit, for example, with Maya and Omar and their work. It's really, really interesting. And in my book, I often talked about fragmentation as perhaps being more negative, or sort of commenting on something traumatic happening in society. And I thought it was really beautiful how Omar and Maya were actually talking about it being something positive and kind of using it for a very different reason, and using that in their collection as a driving force. I thought that was fantastic and really sort of eye-opening to see that.
Yeah, I wondered as well. Oh, sorry, Lucy.
No, go ahead, Leah.
No, I wondered as well if in that, thinking about fragmentation in a positive way, it kind of made me think about what Eric was saying about Kelly using appropriation and reappropriation and taking bits and yeah, refashioning them and using them for good. And that kind of, I thought that linked really interestingly with that idea of fragmentation that was talked about by Omar. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And it also came up with Rebecca's sweeping this morning back in Tan Fantasy. I think it was really, really interesting, the different influences that sort of mixed together. And Rebecca was speaking about not just the visual fragmentation, but also the fragmentation even in the music and the soundtrack, and so all those different sort of styles and songs being sampled and referenced. So it's really interesting to think of how it works, not just visually, but also sort of in a more haptic and also sort of an audio sense as well.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because I use fragments in my research as well. And in my thesis, I note how actually fragments are very important because they are the microhistories that make up, you know, the stories that we don't hear about in the master narrative. And so fragments to me are very important to decolonize fashion studies and to have a more complete story of what has happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And speaking of decolonization, that's a really important point to bring up. And Liz, I was wondering whether you might want to talk a little bit more about your work and looking at sort of globalization and Brazilian dress. And I wonder whether you've noticed any of these themes of any manifestations of trauma at all in the work that you've been studying?
I think more in terms of, I'm kind of thinking about like what the methods are we use, you know, because I think that we need new methods, you know, methods that do, that's why I kind of posed the question, how do we make sure we're not kind of fetishizing emotion? But like how can we use it within research to kind of get closer to, I talk a lot about anonymous photographic subjects, you know, how can emotion be a tool, but then, you know, not projecting or not, you know, I'm not sure, it's difficult to kind of understand how to like grapple with it. Yeah, but I think that we need new methods that can help us to kind of, because one of the problems I find is that unknown histories or micro histories, everyday histories, these are things of fashion or photography. They're things where we don't know who people are. It can be quite hard to kind of find a thread to sort of follow. I've just been in Brazil trying to kind of find examples of everyday dress in archives, and it's really, really difficult. And I've ended up like resorting to glass plate negatives and using like a loop where you can actually look at clothing in real depth, and you can begin to get a sense of the materiality within a two-dimensional representation. But what I'm trying to say is, I think that decolonizing is that when we're kind of up against all of these challenges in our research, is being creative to find new ways. And I think there's a, you know, in order to yeah, and so I'm wondering how kind of emotion could be one method to do that. But I don't really have any answers. I just have loads of questions floating through my head.
I think that's really interesting, Liz, about the kind of, yeah, using unknown photographs and kind of wanting to be, yeah, not fetishize trauma and be sensitive to those people in those photographs, and yeah, the possible pitfalls of placing trauma or violence on people who maybe they didn't, or maybe they did but in a different way, or you know, how do you navigate that territory?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I was going to say that's so interesting, because it's like, it sounds as if as researchers we could also commit violence in reading into these resources. And I feel like I've kind of experienced that a little bit, because when looking at photographs, so I look at Singapore fashion history, and when I look at photographs, sometimes I see what I want to see, or I'm looking at it again in a contemporary context. And I know that when I do my oral history interviews, I'm always somehow like, an idea is like, oh, okay, I thought this, but it's actually that. And if I don't have that to corroborate, then I could just read into the photo pretty much what I want. I mean, of course, it's guided by my experience and my skill sets that I have accumulated, but then, you know, there's always that danger of going too far. Yeah. So another potential source of violence there.
And I suppose that's what I was trying to kind of pick up, this idea that, emotion is politicized and it's historicized. So we need to kind of place ourselves as, researchers. I think like, we know we have to do that now. Like, we're part of, like, our practice is part of an effective, I suppose, economy. Do you know what I mean? But it's still, by which I mean we kind of embody the theories we're reading and then we apply them. I have lots of questions, because it's something I'm kind of grappling with at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel similarly.
Okay, so I guess we're kind of approaching it gingerly. I mean, with a great sense of responsibility as well. And I have now a comment from Elena. It seems like there can never be any complete objectivity in understanding or representing a subject. So true. Perhaps it is therefore to tell a story as an author researcher, where you tell a story subjectively. We as users, readers do perceive these subjectively anyway. That's such a good point. And I think for a while, I'm not sure, like when I was in undergrad, it wasn't the practice, at least in Singapore, to kind of put myself in my thesis or in my writing. It was usually done in a third person. It had been how I'd done things all the time. But then in doing the MA at the Koto and then the PhD, I kind of had to really put myself front and center and kind of declare my affiliations, my leanings, the way I'm looking at things, to understand the images so that, it's like right up there, up front. And I wonder if that's been the same with all of you, or you've always felt very comfortable to put yourself within your research.
That's absolutely something I am working on, and is kind of an important part of my thesis and my methodology, at least in part of my thesis. Is very much about kind of the researcher as actor and as subjective actor and how we navigate that and how we can use that as well, how we can use that productively to tell story, to tell histories, and to engage with the past, but acknowledge it and celebrate it, and go use it to try and deal with history in a slightly different way from the way we have been. I think that's probably a very vague vague answer to that. But yeah, it's definitely something I'm really working on at the moment.
But I think I'll go on, Lucy.
Oh no, go Liz, it's fine.
No, please.
I was just going to say, Lee, I think that's really, really interesting. I'd love to hear more about that aspect of your work. And I think it's something that maybe is changing in academia. I think sort of traditionally, it was always warned not to be personal or subjective, and not even to bring in, and you were talking earlier about the sort of the bios of designers or makers. And, traditionally people have been encouraged to sort of not really bring in those autobiographical or biographical details, but actually I think that is changing, and we are becoming more aware of that, and it's not necessarily something to shy away from, but actually we can use it responsibly and use it really effectively in certain occasions. I think it's something that maybe sort of currently and in the future, maybe that is sort of shifting in terms of our approaches.
Yeah, I think maybe we need to distinguish too between subject position and, I suppose, identity politics, in the sense that you can be a white European woman, or and there's an extent to which you cannot escape that kind of ingrained outlook, that would have aspects of racism embedded within it, but it doesn't mean that outlook has to then be your identity politics, as in maybe we have to think of strategies for how to kind of work through that. That's what I try to tell my students, because I think otherwise they feel just kind of like weighed down by something, and guilt is also not necessarily a productive
we can't help being who we are. We are who we are. As Nat says in her comments as well, I think we often see things as we are. So there's no escaping that, but we can work through them. And Manny also notes that it's the power of self and self-empowerment. So I think on that note, I just want to wrap up the themes that we have talked about in this plenary session. I think what we have realized is that even though the conference is about violence, but there's also all these positive ways that fashion can allow us to take back the power, to resolve things in a gentler way, to connect with each other, and to experience fashion and life through fashion, I guess, or experience life through fashion in a way that's healing as well. And I think I speak for everyone in the plenary session when I say that this has been an amazing conference with fascinating papers, with presenters who have been very open, very brave, as Lucy mentioned, in sharing with us their personal experiences, in sharing with us their amazing work. So I wanted to say thank you so much to all of you who are still with us in this session. Thank you for joining us for the past 2 days. And congratulations to Lucy for putting this together. It's a wonderful endeavor. And I now call the conference to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Just to quickly respond to that, thank you as well for chairing this session. Thank you to all of our wonderful chairs, all of our incredible speakers, for your generosity. It's just been astounding, and the knowledge and insights that you've been sharing. It's been so, so rich and given me so many different things to think about. So really looking forward to sort of digesting all of this. And thank you so much also to Rebecca for helping me to organise this conference, to everybody at the Courtauld and at LCF for helping to put this together as well. It's been sort of a really, really wonderful experience. I can't thank everybody enough. And I think with this session we've just had, it's ended on such a lovely note because I started the conference in my paper talking about fashion and death. And we've literally just ended on joy and life and healing. So I think that's a really, really nice sort of full circle to be ending on. So thank you.